G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. And one of the most dangerous things that one has to consider in this crazy cacophony of media that we're all consuming, and in the case of someone like me also producing, is just how dangerous do you want the ideas that you consider, that you discuss, that you maybe even propagate to be? How much will you play footsie with things that are far enough outside the envelope of normal conversations that many people will find them offensive? And I want to use one individual today as a case study of how corrosive and potentially dangerous it can be to expand the conversation into territory where it basically brings out the worst in all of us. Tucker Carlson is someone I've been fascinated by for a long time. To say that I'm a student of his broadcasting style would be insulting to him and to me. But he is unique, and in some ways I worry that he may be the most dangerous person in America. People talk about what happens to the Republican Party after Donald Trump, whether Donald Trump Jr. will run, whether J.D. Vance will run. I've long had an inkling that Tucker Carlson is the real heir to Trumpism and could be far more dangerous as a president someday than President Trump. He has all of the showman's instincts that Trump does with a lot less of the baggage, and he's a lot cannier and a lot smarter. He first came to my attention in an infamous segment which Jon Stewart did when he was invited on Tucker Carlson's old show. This is going back 21 years now. Tucker had a show on CNN called Crossfire, which ostensibly debated issues of American politics from both sides. And Tucker Carlson would get up there as this precocious, brash, highly intelligent conservative wearing a bow tie and eviscerate lefties. He was a fan of Jon Stewart's, so they invited Jon on the show. Jon came on and totally annihilated them to such an extent that Crossfire was soon cancelled. And the head of CNN said that Jon Stewart's appearance and the arguments that he made were a contributing factor to that cancellation. Here's a little bit of how that went down.
I'm here to confront you because we need help from the media, and they're hurting us. And it's now, the idea is...
If the indictment is... Let me get this straight. If the indictment is... if the indictment is, and I have seen you say this, that Crossfire reduces everything, as I said in the intro, to left, right, black, white.
Yes.
Well, it's because, see, we're a debate show. It's like saying the
no,
Channel
that'd be great.
To a storm front.
I would love to see a debate show.
In a 24-hour day where we have each side on as best we can get them.
That would be great.
And have them fight it out.
To do a debate would be great, but that's like saying pro wrestling is a show about athletic competition.
Sorry. I think you're a good comedian. I think your lectures are boring. Let me ask you a question on the news.
No, this is theater. I mean, it's obvious. How old are you?
35.
And you wear a bow tie.
Yeah, I do. I do.
So this is...
No, I know.
So
You're right. No, let me just go. No, come on.
And listen, I'm not suggesting that you're not a smart guy, because those are not easy to tie. But the thing is that you're doing theater when you should be doing debate.
So that was 21 years ago, and in the interim, Tucker Carlson ended up on Fox News and became the most successful talk show host in America with his nightly show. He was unceremoniously dumped, quite mysteriously, a few years ago by the Murdochs, who ostensibly seemed to feel that he was getting a bit too big for his boots. He was broadcasting from his own bunker that he'd set up in Maine, and he was essentially a one-man band, and he was getting a larger and larger following of populist Americans who were culturally disenchanted, who were feeling a lot of demographic anxiety about the way the United States was headed, and he was more unpredictable than ever and veering off the talking points of conventional Republican politics and of the Murdochs' priorities far too much. So one day, on a Friday night, he wished his viewers a good weekend and said he'd see them again on Monday, and then he went into Lachlan Murdoch's office and was told to clear out his desk. After that, he's become an internet phenomenon, his podcast is absolutely massive, and he's started sitting down with more and more controversial people. Most recently, a young, racist, popular anti-Semite called Nick Fuentes, who he had on his show pretty unquestioningly in a pretty softball interview where Nick was given the opportunity to say things like this.
The main challenge to that, a big challenge to that, is organized Jewry in America. I see Jewishness as the common denominator.
So apparently blaming America's ills on organized Jewry, in other words, the Jews, the oldest slander in the book, is now just something that people of Tucker Carlson's pedigree feel is an appropriate idea to put on the dining table of America's media diet. And when Tucker was pulled up on this and questioned about it by his former friend and colleague, the other conservative broadcaster Megyn Kelly, recently, he had this defense.
Nick Fuentes has said a long list of very vile things.
Big time, including attacking my dad, which was the most vile of all, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I personally have watched videos of him questioning the Holocaust, likening it to baking cookies in the oven, and there's no way you could have gotten to 6 million, seems to be his theory. He seems to think that we've way overstated the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust. He's ripped on poor Usha Vance in the most offensive terms, which I mean, so what do you say to those people? Say, why didn't you raise any of that?
You know, do your own interview the way that you want to do it. You're not my editor. Buzz off. I mean, I don't know. You want to go yell at Nick Fuentes? I'll give you his cell. Call him and go sit and yell at him and feel virtuous or whatever. That's up to you. I got the same thing with Putin. Why aren't you yelling at him? Okay, why? So I can show that I'm a good person? I care about what my wife thinks, my children think, and God thinks, and that's it. I don't need to prove that I'm a good person to you. You may think I'm a terrible person. Okay, I'm just doing my thing, which is I want to understand what people think. And I'm committed to that. And if you don't like it, don't watch. That's my view.
Now, to some extent, he sort of has a point. He's allowed to talk to whoever he wants to talk to, and people are allowed to either watch his show or not watch his show. But the sort of gentlemanly agreement that has existed amongst major media figures and media outlets to sideline ideas that we know are pernicious has completely fallen apart and crumbled. We saw that during COVID, and we're seeing it more and more now. And I'm not sure that the correct response to Tucker's instinct is just to clutch our pearls and circle the wagons and say, these ideas must never be discussed. Because all that does is give them a sort of a frisson of naughtiness and makes young people who are interested in rebelling, who are interested in pushing back against the sanctimonious piety of the people who they regard as being the elites, the people who they think have done such a bad job of governing the country and the world over the past few generations, gives them a reason to feel like, well, maybe there's something here. If everybody is telling us that we're not allowed to talk about these things, why are you trying to stamp down on my freedom of speech? Instead, I'd rather have a conversation, an uncomfortable conversation, if you will, about the way we have conversations about controversial things and the way that individuals like Tucker Carlson are so good at the alchemy of taking a few ideas, a few low-grade true ideas, and spinning them into the gold of eyeballs and conspiracies and big compelling narratives that can make a lot of sense. The way we might do this today is by looking at a speech that Tucker Carlson gave last year. He was invited to Australia by a conservative organisation on a multi-city speaking tour. He spent a couple of weeks in Australia, and he gave a speech to very favourable conservative audiences in almost every major city. Let's have a listen to it. Because some of what he says is true, a lot of what he says is not true, and the bits that are true get manipulated by his worldview into a narrative about what has gone wrong with the West that it's worth being mindful of and it's worth noticing, so that when you're in conversations with people who consume a lot of this stuff, you sort of understand what the backdrop is to what they're saying, and you don't get bogged down in nitpicking particular details about nuclear energy or immigration or migrant assimilation or whatever it might be. You can sort of step back and understand, oh, okay, this conversation is actually not a conversation about the details. It's not a conversation about the shit that Tucker Carlson is collecting. It's a conversation about the gold that he is spinning that shit into with his unique brand of alchemy. Some of this I will just let run, but I hand the table over briefly to Tucker Carlson, and I will interject where necessary.
This is my last night in Australia. I've been here 2.5 weeks. This is my 7th city, and I'm just absolutely in love with your country, and I mean that. And I will be back. I've spent my whole life thinking about coming here. I'm 55, so that's like 50 years. And I grew up in a country that just idolized Australia. We just loved it. Everything about it. I grew up in a surf community. We thought you're surfers, all of whom are named Shane, I think, at the time. We thought they were the coolest. we thought all of your women were like Elle Macpherson, like every woman in Australia looks like Elle Macpherson. And that everybody in Australia is attacked by some sort of deadly animal every day of the week and thinks nothing of it. And that's all kind of true, I've decided. It's all sort of true. It's the most beautiful country I've ever been to, the most lightly populated, and it has functional cities, which is something I'm not used to at all. You know, where I live, it's like, it's incredibly beautiful, but you have to escape the cities. Here you go to the cities and they're great. You're like, I could live here if I could afford it, which I can't. I love your profanity, not all of which I understand, but it's used liberally. Words we don't have, I'm not going to repeat them. I repeated them the other night to people. They're like, oh, that's a bad word. I was like, we don't even have that word. I have no idea what it means. It's like swearing in Mandarin. It doesn't offend me, you know? And I think I, above all, like, if I'm being honest, this is a little syrupy, but I'm leaving tomorrow, so I'll just be honest. But I love how much you love animals. I just love that. And it's a very Anglo quality. It's part of the culture that we share, you know, all derived from the UK.
So just notice what he's setting up here. There's a lot of flattery that's to be expected. He said a couple of things that are worth bearing in mind. The cities are great. He likes the cities here because they're not full of crime. They're not full of dysfunction. They're not full of homeless people and drug addicts, presumably. So just bear that in mind. And now he says that he loves our love for animals. Also great and laudable. And he says in his explanation of why we love animals that this is an Anglo thing. He just used the word Anglo, right? We derive it from Britain, apparently. Just note that.
But I've never seen it at this scale. And before I came here, I mean, I had heard a million accounts of many people who had come here who would say, you know, that old cliche about how every animal in Australia is looking to kill you. That's all true. And the Australians aren't bothered by it. That turns out to be true also. But it's deeper than that. I thought it was just bravery and sort of devil-may-care nonchalance, which is clearly true, but it's also like such a profound love of animals. The other night, 2 nights ago, we were having dinner and people were telling me about your magpies and how they dive bomb people. And this woman said, I didn't know if this was like one of those drop bear or hoop snake stories designed to like scare the foreigners, or I didn't know if they were being serious, because in my country, magpies are just chirpy birds. But here they're deadly. And she's telling me how the mailmen, posties, I think she called them, wear helmets with spikes on top to keep the birds off. And I'm like, that's not real. Oh, it's totally real. And then she shows me videos of it. I'm like shocked by the whole thing. And then she goes, you know, they're highly intelligent. I was like, yeah, you should shoot them. And then you just kill like the first year's worth, and all the other magpies will get together and be like, let's leave the mailman alone. You know, because they're smart. This woman looked at me like I was a child molester or a freak. She's like, shoot them? No. And I said, you know, in my country, I mean, I love animals. I live with animals, but I also hunt birds. But our rule is, if the animal's trying to kill you, that's a violation of the creation contract as outlined in Genesis 2, which is you have dominion over them. Like, they're not, you know, we can all live kind of peacefully together, but if you try and kill me, then I have to, you know, fight back. And having free will and opposable thumbs, like, I'm gonna win. And this woman looked at me, honestly, like I was a monster. Like, no. And then that reminded me of a conversation I had the week before where this guy's telling me how he found a brown snake in his garage. And I was like, the brown snake, like the world famous, like second most poisonous snake in the world? He goes, yeah. And I thought, if I found a brown snake in my garage, well, I'd burn the garage down, obviously, immediately. I just toss a cup of gasoline in there and torch it. It's well worth it, insured or not. And then I'd call the army to kill all the other, I mean, brown snakes don't live alone. They're produced by other brown snakes. And obviously, we need to commit brown snake genocide just for our own survival. I said, and I'm not joking at all. And I said, what'd you do? He goes, my wife tossed me a broom and I shoot it out. And he wasn't kidding at all. And I realized these are people who love animals so much that killing them is like not only a last resort, it's like kind of horrifying. It's horrifying. And I thought, what a wonderful and true reflection of the character of the country, because love of animals is the beginning of decency, because you have control over animals. They're a version of children. Unlike children, if you mistreat your kids, like they turn 18 and they hate you and they go on a campaign against you and become drug addicts. But animals, you can do whatever you want to them and there's nothing they can ever do. And so that is the measure of who you really are, how you treat the defenseless, the helpless, people or animals for whom you're responsible. You have dominion over them. You're responsible for them, in some cases their care, and that increases your responsibility to be kind and decent to them. And so I really think that is the clearest picture of who you are, and I could not be more impressed. And I also would say, as a policy matter, that should be, honestly, should be your standard for who you let into your country. You can't live in Australia unless you love animals. I mean, I don't think you're allowed even to bring cigarettes into your country. You certainly can't bring firearms. Why would you bring people who hate animals or who don't respect them or who eat endangered animals for fun? Like, no.
So here we start getting into the way in which the narrative and the worldview that Tucker is trying to impart gets subtly smuggled into things that are completely unrelated. He's noticed here that we don't shoot magpies and we don't declare an all-out genocide on brown snakes, that we have some kind of respect for the natural environment, especially the native natural environment, the native animals. And now we're at a point at which he says, so the conclusion to that is you shouldn't allow people into this country who don't have a respect for animals, which sounds reasonably innocuous until you ask yourself, well, how do Americans and Australians raise animals? I mean, certainly in America, it's almost exclusively through factory farms, through concentrated animal feeding operations. Now, Tucker Carlson is not a vegetarian. That doesn't mean he's not allowed to love animals, but it does mean that in terms of the institutionalized treatment of animals, it's a little bit bizarre to come from a country where, pigs are kept in crates in order to maximize the profit that an industrial farming operation is able to extract from selling each pound of their flesh, and turn it into a question about we shouldn't be allowing people who, presumably he's not talking about individual people, he's talking about people who come from what, countries, maybe cultures, maybe, races or ethnicities that allegedly mistreat animals or mistreat the kinds of animals that he wouldn't want to see mistreated or mistreat them in a different way than we in the West mistreat them. It's just an interesting switch, and it can sort of slide by you instinctively because, sure, why would you want people here who want to burn cats alive or something? But he's sort of dropping these little breadcrumbs that make it much, much easier to end up at his final destination, which is an entire conspiratorial worldview about what is going wrong with the West. But the pillars that he's building on which to ground that worldview, each of them are slightly erroneous, but also a little bit true. The true bit is it's a judge of a person's character as to whether or not they abuse animals. It's a judge of a person's character as to whether or not they treat helpless, defenseless creatures who are in their orbit with a certain level of respect and humanity. Absolutely true. Why wouldn't that get a round of applause? He's also quite a funny and charming guy. I mean, compare them to Donald Trump's rambling rants, and Tucker Carlson is a lot more switched on, a lot easier to follow for a reasonable person. But the leaps that he's making in building these pillars of his argument are, well, let's just say a little bit strange, even at this early point.
I'm actually not kidding at all. You should make that your standard because above all, you want to keep your country decent. And that is the measure of decency. And you have a right to do that. You have a right to observe your national character, particularly if your national character is good, which yours is. It is good. That's exactly right. And what's so interesting, of all the countries being targeted for destruction, which is, the entire English-speaking world, that's obviously true.
Okay, this is also interesting. So the entire Western world is being targeted for destruction. He just sort of says that as if it's a fact. But the line before that is also really interesting. He says a couple of things. He says, if you want to keep your country decent, it's a great choice of words. He's a wordsmith. If you want to keep your country decent, who wouldn't want to be decent? And if you are decent, who wouldn't want to remain decent? Why would you want to contaminate your country, your decent, good, upstanding, moral country, with things that are indecent from abroad, people who have no respect for your own decency? And the second thing that he says is, you have every right to do that. So it becomes a frame not of, should we be excluding people who come from places that have less of a respect for animals or a different attitude towards animals than we do. And rather than a should, it becomes a can we? May we? Are we permitted to? Well, of course we are permitted to, right? You have a right to keep your country decent. Anyone who tells you that you should let in somebody from a place that doesn't have the same attitude towards magpies and brown snakes as you is disputing your right to oppose your country's becoming indecent. Let's continue.
There's a case to be made against some of those countries. I mean, they sort of did bad things in the past. No one currently living, but you can look at the history of certain countries. I'm not pointing out any in particular, Great Britain, but, you could say, well, we're wrecking the country because of the sins of its ancestors. What exactly were your sins? I think you guys got sent here. By the way, everyone I ask when I was like, why were your ancestors sent here? It's always the same answer. You know what it is? Stealing a loaf of bread. I don't believe that for a second, by the way. I just don't believe that. It was armed robbery in every case, but it's like, oh, stealing a loaf of bread. Yeah, okay, right. But anyway, not only did you not do anything wrong, this was the prison that you turned into paradise. You have nothing to apologize for at all.
Australia has nothing to apologize for. He does the gag about some countries have a historical past that, was less than perfect. He says Great Britain. I guess he's talking about colonialism. I don't know how you can talk about the historical crimes of Britain in colonialism and elide the historical crimes of Australia in the genocide of Indigenous populations. I mean, either he's just playing dumb here, and I think he is because of what is about to come in the conversation, but it's just worth noting that we're going from decency and Australia's right to uphold its decency to the claim that it is not only decent today as a place and a people, but that historically there is nothing to be ashamed of, not even the way that First Nations people were treated. Let's continue.
And yet, at every turn, they're making you apologize. I have never seen a society more under attack than the one you're living in now, and for less justification. Every time a commercial airline lands, every time any kind of ceremony opens, they send you the message that you're on someone else's land. And I'm thinking to myself, look, and this is no slight against the people they're talking about at all, but it's Australian land, and you're all Australians. And, I guess my first question is, why would you ever put up with that? And that's not a question that I can answer because I'm not Australian. I didn't hear what you said, but I think I agree with you. But my second question is, who is this helping? Who is this helping? Is it helping the people who are supposedly being honored by these displays? No, of course not. It has nothing to do with them. Now, we have something very similar going on in my country, where the people in charge try to make you feel bad about things that people you never met did hundreds of years ago, but your feeling bad doesn't help the people they claim to represent.
So, hang on. We've gone from saying that there is nothing for Australians to be ashamed of in their past to now saying that present-day Australians and Americans shouldn't be made to feel guilty for the bad things that their ancestors did, people they've never met did a long time ago. And this is part of Tucker's great craftsmanship, which is that he takes things that have become hot culture war issues where there really is a sense of general frustration about how far things have gone in terms of identitarian politics, in terms of social justice posturing, in terms of the kind of censorious finger-wagging virtue signaling that especially corporations have come to do since the sort of peak woke of 2018 to 2022. And when he says that you can't land in a commercial airliner without being told that you should feel guilty for living in this land because it's not really your land, what he's referring to is the fact that Qantas and other airlines in Australia, every time they land, they'll say, welcome to the land of the Wiradjuri people or whatever the local, indigenous tribe was. And they'll say, there'll be something in the airport that'll say it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This is now a tokenistic thing that, although it exists a little bit in some parts of America, in the Pacific Northwest, you find this kind of gesturing. It is now a mainstream part of the fabric of Australian society. There is no awards ceremony. There is no HR meeting. There is barely any website that doesn't begin with either a pop-up page or a recognition of the traditional owners of the land. This is irritating to many Australians. They feel like, we get it, we understand this now, we don't have to keep saying it. How many times do we have to keep saying it? If we're at a conference, do we have to say it before every single speech? We said it at 9 a.m. Do we have to say it again at 11 a.m.? Are we going to say it again at 1 p.m.? We know that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's still going to be Aboriginal land at 3 p.m. when we say it again. It's still going to be Aboriginal land at 5 p.m. when we say it at the next meeting. It has become this tokenistic way for white people to pat themselves on the back about how they're on the right side of history without actually having to do anything that materially benefits First Nations people. So there is a genuine critique here. But it's not just being leveled by Tucker Carlson as a genuine critique of a practice that has become a little bit of a mutual masturbation exercise amongst university-educated, mostly white elites. He's doing something bigger, which is, again, he's building another pillar for his worldview, for this kind of conspiratorial narrative that he's going to end up spinning, and which motivates so much of his broadcast output at the moment, and which I'm so afraid of because I think it is a compelling narrative to people who feel left behind by globalization and certainly have become isolated and atomized by social media, and God only knows what artificial intelligence is going to bring. So there is a ripe base of middle Americans and middle Australians and middle everybody's who is going to be vulnerable to weaving this kind of narrative, which is why I'm trying to break it down and understand it for what it is. So this pillar takes the excesses of woke and the kind of virtue signaling of welcomes to country, acknowledgements of country, land acknowledgements, and it says not only is this kind of an irritating sort of lefty bubble, but that it is a way of trying to make us feel like we're permanently guilty and fundamentally illegitimate in this country. Let's continue and see how he does it.
Lives are getting steadily worse every year. So it's not really about the past, which cannot be fixed. It's about the future. And what is the future that they have planned for you? Of course. If they're telling you, because what is the message? Well, the message is it's not your country. Well, that's exactly what the message is. It's very explicit. I went to church yesterday. I went to see the church in the denomination that I belong to, or did before I left because it became pagan. But I went, you have a giant cathedral in this city built by, my denomination, which is the Church of England, I'm ashamed to say. And as I walked in, there's not one thing about God, of course, that's like way, way in the past. There's a huge sign saying basically we apologize for having this church here because we stole the land. And I thought, I'm not sure, again, who that helps, but I'm pretty sure I know the purpose of it. If at every turn they're telling you it's not your country, a country that, by the way, your ancestors built, and they did an amazing job. Amazing. I'd say, and this is not flattery. I mean, I'm literally leaving tomorrow early, so I can say whatever I want, and you can't do anything about it. So I'll be back in the United States, which is 10,000 miles from here, so I'm being completely honest. The amount of effort that previous generations of Australians went into building this country is just shocking to me. First of all, I had no idea Australia was so rich in the 19th century. Wool apparently was a really good business, wool and gold, note to self. But they didn't just take the money and build private villas. They spent a huge percentage of it on public works and built these remarkable, again, coming from a country with decayed cities, and I went out to Perth, and of course everyone on the East Coast makes fun of Perth relentlessly, but in a very sort of dry, passive-aggressive Australian way. And I don't know anything about it, it's not my world, so I'm like, I'm going to Perth tomorrow, what's that like? Oh, well, it's far away. What does that mean? What? It means we don't like Perth, so I was not expecting much, and I was shocked by it. It was like a San Francisco without the junkies. It was like one of the prettiest places I've ever been. And I feel that way about all of your cities. So, somebody spent a lot of years and a lot of money and a lot of backbreaking effort to build what you have now. And it's just remarkable, but rather than being proud of it, the people who run your country are telling you you should be ashamed of it and that it doesn't belong to you. You have no claim to it at all.
So just note what's happening here. He's talking about cities again. He said this at the beginning, that Australian cities are really nice. They're not like San Francisco. They don't have a bunch of junkies. They don't have a lot of homeless people. And that 19th century Australians, when they got rich off wool, invested a huge amount in this country, and we should be grateful for it. He even says the word public works. Public works. And why does Australia not have the levels of poverty that the United States has? One large reason is because we've been more committed to public welfare. We've been more of a social democracy along the lines of continental Europe, not as far as the Scandinavian countries, but probably halfway between them and the United States, than America is. And Tucker is on the side of politics that most consistently opposes social safety net programs, Medicare for all, a proper, robust minimum wage so that you can bolster the middle class and achieve the sort of prosperity that cities like Perth exhibit. Policies that run counter to the rampant inequality that can be seen in the United States, that are much more egalitarian and redistributive, which is not normally championed by his side of politics. But those public works, that history of public infrastructure, that history of egalitarianism in the Australian tradition is what we should be grateful for, and what welcomes to country and land acknowledgements and recognition of Indigenous custodianship of the land is supposed to make us feel guilty about. So again, he's weaving these threads between unrelated issues and saying not only is it misguided to be doing these recognitions of Indigenous land ownership, but that it is a cynical way for elites, for shadowy cabals of people, and this will someday open the door to his conversations about Jews, because the shadowiest cabal always comes back to Jews, financiers, bankers, an international conspiracy of some kind in which the Jews are always implicated. But even if you exclude, the overtones of anti-Semitism after we've seen what ended up where he's ended up now with Nick Fuentes, even if you just look at the spirit of ungenerosity with which he interprets things that he dislikes. So in this kind of patina of like, I'm just asking questions, I'm just a regular guy, I'm just standing up for your rights, I'm just standing up for decency, he's sowing seeds of, they're not only doing this in order to, the airlines are not only doing land acknowledgements, the church is not only putting up a gesture of solidarity with Indigenous custodianship of the land because they're virtue signaling to their peers and they want to look like they're on the right side of history and they're pandering to a kind of a meme mob. But actually, they're doing it intentionally. They're doing it because they want Australians to not feel proud of the things that their forefathers did, which incidentally are things that Tucker Carlson's side of politics does not support. So inconsistent, to say the least. Let's continue.
So the conventional understanding of this is, well, this is just what it is to be guilty. You're in a prosperous country and you feel guilty. But that's not actually what it's about. Because making people feel guilty doesn't help anybody, right? No. They're telling you it's not your country so that they can take it away from you and you won't resist when they do. Because it doesn't belong to you in the first place.
Okay, so now we're getting explicit about what was previously just implicit. The reason why we're being told that we should feel guilty for our civilization and that the land we're standing on is actually the land of people who were here for tens of thousands of years before our ancestors arrived is so that they can take it away from us and we won't have a leg to stand on because we've already ceded that it's not ours.
And if there's one message that I hope I could pass on, and by the way, I feel a little guilty lecturing you about your country since I've been here 2 weeks and I know nothing, and there's nothing worse than a foreigner lecturing you about your own country. I'm thinking through the hostility I feel when Bono comes to my country and starts lecturing me. Go back to Dublin or whatever, you know what I mean? Please leave, foreigner. So I don't want to be that preachy person at all. I'm saying this with respect, but with actual concern. I'm telling you, anyone who tells you this is not your country will take it away from you and plans to do that. And they do plan to do that. That's super obvious to me. It's really obvious to me. And this is not an attack on, any other country. By the way, I know you all are completely paranoid about China. And you have every reason to be. I don't fault the Chinese for that. If I were the Chinese, the first thing I would do is take over Australia. It's the first thing I would do. I've got a country of 1.4 billion that's crowded with not enough natural resources, and not that far away is an entire continent with 26 million people. It's got more resources than it could ever use. I'd take over that country immediately. And I wouldn't do it with warships, I'd just buy their politicians. And my sense is, yours aren't very expensive at all. In fact, one hilarious thing I've noticed, again, since I don't know anything about Australia, so you ask really stupid questions. So I learned that one of your parties is the Labour Party, and it's the party of Labour Unit. Boo, okay. No, but this is the hilarious part from my perspective. So I'm like going through the list of the leaders, and I'm like, okay, what trade are they in? Are they electricians, forklift drivers, plumbers, miners? None of them's ever had a job. There's no actual labor in the leadership of the Labour Party. They're all parasites on the taxpayer. It's hilarious. You don't see the humor in that when the laziest people in your country call themselves the Labour Party? Really, if you're the Labour Party, why don't you get a job? None of them ever had a job. They can't do anything. Oh, it's so funny. Can you change the tire of my truck? My air conditioner broke. Can you get over here and fix it? Oh, I'm sorry. You've only worked in the government? Why don't you go away and shut up? And the last thing you're allowed to do is tell me that it's not my country when you have literally no skills. You would starve to death without your job.
I mean, I guess this is a good punchline. I can't tell. Is he just unfamiliar with the terminology of the way that center-left parties are labeled outside of the United States? I mean, all of these same criticisms could be made of the Democratic Party, and in fact, he goes on to admit that. But Labour is just a word that countries like New Zealand and Australia and the UK use to talk about their center-left parties. However, I will acknowledge there's a germ of a real criticism here, which is that representative democracies were founded on the idea that people from the regular community would go to the capital city and they would judiciously assess, consider in an even-handed way the concerns of the nation, and they would pass laws, and then those laws would be enacted, and basically those representatives would be enacting the will of the people rather than having some kind of a complicated, messy, direct democracy where everyone was constantly voting on specific referenda all the time, like they sort of do a little bit in California and Switzerland and places like that. So, yes, the corrosion of the idea of representation by regular people from the community into the evolution of political parties where there are full-time politicians who spend their entire lives as politicians vying with each other to get elected and to scramble up the greasy ladder of internal politics. That is a real problem, and he's pointing to a real thing. I don't think that has anything to do with whether or not the Labour Party should be called the Labour Party because it's staffed by professional politicians instead of labourers. That's not the point of the name. It's supposed to be the party that represents the working people rather than the party that consists of truck drivers. That was never the intention of the Labour Party, and it doesn't purport to be. On the issue of China, he's also touching a raw nerve there. Again, it's something that is true. There is a strained relationship between Australia, which is the only big Western democracy in the part of the world that China regards as being its patch. So Australia is torn between its strategic loyalty to the United States and NATO and Europe and the UK on the one hand, and its economic and geographical ties to China. This is a real conundrum for Australia, probably the biggest conundrum over the course of this century, along with dealing with the impacts of climate chaos. But none of these things are aided by simply making a quip about how the first thing that you would do if you were China is invade Australia, although buying off the politicians is another true barb. So this is all just to point out the way in which he drops breadcrumbs of truth in order to construct the narrative. We've got the fact that politicians are disengaged. They don't come from the community. They're now professional politicians. They're more beholden to each other and to corporations and to lobbyists and to the global elite than they are to the little guy. He's making that point with regard to the Labour Party. The fact that we are too beholden to China's economic interests, and also, he doesn't say this, but it would be implicit in most of the audience's minds to our strategic relationship with the United States. That is also a true thing that is being brought up. The fact that our wrestling with our history with Indigenous Australians has become performative and difficult and complicated and irksome for many people. This is also true, and this is why I've been saying for years that, the left side of politics should be careful about how much they antagonize Middle Australia and Middle America, because it allows people to be more vulnerable to narratives like this. But without blaming the victim, he is being able to establish this kind of cathedral of a story that makes sense because each of these little pillars that he's laying down is consistent with the vision that he's trying to build.
I mean, trust me, I'm not making fun. I mean, I live in a country, that's run by the exact same kind of people. Joe Biden has been leeching off the taxpayer since I was 3 years old and I'm 55. Actually, my entire lifetime, Joe Biden has been getting rich without working at taxpayer expense. And also, this may be recognizable, selling influence to China. But I'm just here to tell you, as a representative from a country that's sort of farther on down the road, that it absolutely does not end well at all. And we've lived with this for many years. We also, by the way, didn't understand that the purpose of making native-born Americans feel guilty about living in America was not to right any historic injustice. It was not to help any marginalized group. They have zero interest in that, obviously. Our marginalized groups have become more marginalized over the past 50 years of talking about them incessantly. They're doing worse. They haven't been helped at all.
So marginalized groups are doing worse now than they were 50 years ago. That's just not true, according to most metrics. He also uses an interesting turn of phrase when he's talking about Native Americans. He literally said native-born Americans. It's very close to Native Americans. There were also people living in America before Europeans showed up, Tuck. But native-born Americans is a way for us to talk about essentially kind of white Americans. I mean, let's face it, because most of the criticisms that he's got are about too much immigration, and he'll get to more of that in a second. But native-born Americans has sort of a nice ring to it, and it elevates people who were born there from the immigrants who don't belong here. In a country like Australia, it happens to be the case that the majority of the population has arrived since the Second World War. So although I am a native-born Australian, my mother isn't and my father isn't, and that's a totally normal thing for an Australian family to have. So to single out the people who may have been born here or not born here in a multi-ethnic, high-migrant society like the United States or Australia is just worth noticing the way that he's doing it, and it's a helpful way for him to avoid talking about demographics, ethnicity, and race. So he goes on to talk about whether or not the point of the elites making us all feel guilty about our past and guilty about our Western values and guilty for being native-born Australians or Americans, whether the point is actually to help marginalized people, who he claims have not improved. But I mean, black Americans are better off than they were a half a century ago. Again, there is a germ of truth in all of this, which is that the highly performative race riot reckoning of 2020, the summer of riots, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of these things had a certain air of sanctimoniousness that was detached from the real lived experience of black people. We can see that more people of color were supportive of Donald Trump this time round than they were the first time. The Democrats face a real crisis in their coalition building because so many migrant communities and so many disenfranchised communities are frankly more interested in bread and butter issues and in staving off culture war issues, and they're fundamentally more socially conservative than the kinds of people who run the Democratic Party, that this is a real crisis. He's taking that real crisis, the identity crisis in the United States, which he is imposing, I think, a little bit too aggressively onto Australia, where it's less pressing, and saying not only is the performative leftism and sort of guilt-inducing, black armband view of history not helping minority communities, and he's probably right about that, but that minority communities have not been helped at all over the past half century, which is factually untrue. So Tucker goes back to saying, all right, what is the purpose of the people who are making us feel this guilty? What are they trying to achieve?
So that's not the point. By the way, if that was the point, I'd be like, well, okay. I get a lecture once in a while, my taxes are higher, but at least it's helping somebody. I guess I'm a liberal enough to think that's, I could probably live with that. But if the people they're supposedly helping are getting more desperate every year, my country's getting crappier every year, maybe that's not the point. And I suspect, I'm just guessing, that you're living with something very, very similar. Yes. So look, I know the United States is a long way away. It's 10,000 miles for me to get home. I'm going to make a suggestion. I would suggest that every person in this room scrimp and save for however long it takes and buy a round-trip ticket to London in the next couple years. No, I'm serious. Because I have the great advantage of coming from a country that was born in dislike of the English, even though obviously I am part English, heavily English. I'm a self-hating Briton. But in my country, we exist because we broke off from Great Britain. But the three other countries that didn't, which would be Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, all three have this attitude that Britain is somehow kind of the mothership still. It's like the most impressive place. And these attitudes come from that country. And you should go see it. It's disgusting. No, I'm serious. It's disgusting. And from 1945 until present, Britons have been told that you're terrible, that you're somehow guilty of some non-specified crime. Normal people are the criminals in Great Britain. And by employing that method of psychological control, that psyop, which is exactly what it is, they have managed to turn that country into a slum.
This is an interesting aside about Britain because the UK is copping a lot of criticism at the moment, and it is in a rough spot. I mean, for a lot of reasons. Some of the reasons are uncontrolled migration. Some of the reasons are, these right-wing talking points about the difficulty of assimilating such large numbers, especially of conservative Muslim communities, into the rest of the United Kingdom, and what to do about the demographic anxiety that white Britons feel about their country changing so much. But tied up in that in the UK is surely also the failure of successive governments to fund the NHS properly, the National Health Service, the failure of successive governments to do community building and community policing, the failure of successive governments to invest adequately in education, the failure of vision, really, that we've had for the past 25 years in the United Kingdom. And a lot of this is on Tucker Carlson's side of politics. Now, I know that he plays this game of being like, I'm beholden to no man, but let's face it, I mean, he is on the conservative side of American politics, and conservatives in Britain and the United States consistently cut the programs that could have enabled the UK to more functionally deal with its high rates of immigration, to more functionally deal with the decaying health service, to more functionally deal with the education of both its native-born population and also of migrants who need to be integrated into the communities. So it's a bit glib to just say, we're holding up Britain as this bastion, but what's really go to Britain and you'll see that it's a slum. Firstly, there are lots of reasons why Britain's problems exist, and many of them attributable to conservatives, not just to immigration and the left. And second, it's not a slum everywhere. It is grappling with horrendous rates of inequality, which the United States also is. Go to parts of London which are well-to-do, and they're extremely well-to-do. There are a lot of Russian oligarchs and Arab oil sheikhs doing just fine in the United Kingdom. And Tucker Carlson is on the record as applauding Putin's Russia. He's quite fine with doing deals with whoever you have to do deals with. He's quite down on American exceptionalism and really American interests in general. He's a kind of fly-by-night tap-dancing Pollyanna guy who will take whatever he can take and do whatever he needs to do in order to maintain this sort of I'm just asking questions narrative about the world is a complicated place, but fundamentally Christianity and Western civilization are the best. Now, there are grains of truth in the claim that Western civilization is a great thing. There are grains of truth that Christianity has contributed a lot to human civilization. But for him to identify the problems of the United Kingdom and place them solely at the feet of what? Is he implying diversity and immigration, I guess, with no regard for what right-wing global capital has done to the United Kingdom? It's a little bit evasive, it's a little bit rich, especially coming from him. He is on the side of politics that is much more comfortable with high rates of inequality. I mean, the private opulence of places like London versus the public squalor is in part a consequence of underinvestment in its cities, underinvestment in government programs, and underinvestment in the kinds of public goods which just 10 minutes ago Tucker Carlson was saying had done Australia so well in the past.
And if you haven't been there recently, you should. And I was thinking about it this week when Julian Assange finally got out of a British prison after 5.5 years. I visited him there a few months ago at Belmarsh. I got so upset sitting in my barn in Maine in the middle of nowhere thinking about Assange that I just called his wife and said I want to come over and see him, which I did. And I visited him at the prison, and the prison was slightly better than the surrounding city, I thought, just in terms of cheerfulness. But it was. I'm serious. It is a fog-shrouded slum. But I asked her and him, we're meeting with him there at Belmarsh after being strip searched. I managed to get my nicotine pouches in anyway. Yeah, that's right. Some things are worth committing crimes for. But anyway, not to brag. I'm never going there again, so I can say this. But I said to you, like, what have you been charged with? Nothing. Never charged with a crime in Great Britain. And they held him in maximum security, basically trying to torture him to death for 5.5 years. After 7 years locked away in the Ecuadorian embassy, never charged him with a crime. And I thought to myself, this is a criticism, but I mean it in the best way. Like, what about your country of birth? Where are they in this? Why didn't you sail a warship up the Thames and get your man out? And I'll tell you exactly why, which is because your leaders genuflect before that country. And they shouldn't, because the truth is they have no moral authority. This is such a nicer place than that. You should go from your cities to their cities and ask a really simple question. Who's doing a better job? You are. You're doing a better job. And you should also go because that could be your future if you don't get control.
This is vintage Tucker for me, the master of populism. And I don't really have any criticism of everything that he just said. I mean, the imprisonment, incarceration, the hounding of Julian Assange was terrible. The response of successive Australian governments was craven and pathetic. And Tucker Carlson's instinct, which is to sort of tap the idea that we should be bolstering the little guy, that we should be having pride in things that other people tell us we should be ashamed of, that we should feel like we can stand up to the man, is extremely powerful, especially as populations become more and more disoriented and feel more and more powerless in an increasingly confusing and globalized and algorithmic world. He's right. Why didn't Australia, at least metaphorically, send a warship up the Thames? I mean, when the United States was complicit in incarcerating Julian Assange, the silence from Australian governments, the lack of pressure, the lack of seriousness about drawing a line in the sand and saying the human rights of this individual will not be traversed, and we are a significant enough country to insist that you respond to our concerns about this, that was absent. Now, I would say that what's to blame more than cravenness or a sense of inferiority is this tradition of diplomatic nicety about the way that countries are supposed to behave with each other. And it's that diplomatic nicety which, President Trump is so good at detonating and blowing up and saying, well, why do we have to do things this way? Why can't I just tell my allies to fuck off unless they pay me more money? And there's appeal in that to people who feel like they've been screwed over and stabbed in the back by officials and elites who have always just tried to tap dance around in their own norms without actually standing up for the little guy. So, I mean, on this particular point, I think Tucker is both sort of populist and compelling and cynical and right.
And by get control, I mean you cannot allow them to make you feel guilty for being Australian, that you cannot allow them to tell you this is not your nation when your ancestors built it, you were born here, you pay taxes to that government. No, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't mean you're sensitive. It means you are craven and being prepared to be hurt. And I think it's already happening. I was so impressed by a couple of your cities, I'll just give you a perfect example, that I started looking up your real estate listings. Because I thought, I don't know if I'm welcome here, probably not, but if I ever made any money, I'd like to get a place here because it's like unbelievable. It's so pretty and the people are so nice. And I do want to see the attacking magpies. So I was like, I definitely want to come back. So I'd heard it was kind of, I was in Sydney 2 days ago. I looked it up and then I thought, well, obviously this is in lira or pesos or something. These are not real numbers. And I was like, what is the Australian dollar? And so I got my little calculator out and did the conversion rate. And even after discounting by whatever, 25%, it was so much more that I could afford. And I have a decent job. I was like, how does anybody live here? How does the average Australian making, I don't even know what your average wage is, 100 grand, something in that range-ish? No, that's too high? How do you live here? I mean, that's like... Exactly. So then I asked someone I was traveling with, your housing prices, and not just on Sydney Harbor, but just like normal houses, far from Sydney Harbor, are so expensive. How does anybody live here? And this person said, well, increasingly they don't. They have to leave. A lot of homeless people all of a sudden. I said, that sounds like a crisis. Why is it happening? Well, one of the reasons it's happening is a principle we call supply and demand. And when there's a greater demand for something than there is a supply, the price rises. And that is purely a matter of population. If you have more people than you have houses, guess what happens to housing prices? They rise. This is the most obvious principle in nature and real estate.
Okay, this is interesting. He is now getting to the biggest concern that most Australians have, which is the price of housing and the cost of living. He frames this, once again, this is a classic Tucker trick. Take something that is true, take potentially another explanation for it, which is also true in many other scenarios, make it the only explanation, and then you've got a new pillar that reinforces your worldview. So the thing that is true here is that houses are very expensive in Australia. They're not so expensive that Tucker Carlson can't afford one. I don't know. I love that he keeps going on with this shtick about how, it's too expensive for me to afford to live here. How many years were you the number one person on Fox News? How many listeners does your podcast have? How much are you getting paid to go around the world doing speeches like this, Tucker? You can afford a $2 to $3 million house in Sydney if you want one. But suffice it to say, many people can't. And so he's putting his finger on a very real thing. And then he says, as an explanation, something that's also true, which is that it's about supply and demand. The cost of anything is about supply and demand. Any economist will tell you that. So he establishes those two true things. The houses are expensive, and when things are expensive, the cause is supply and demand. And then he just neatly elides one half of the supply and demand equation, which is supply. He goes straight to demand. The demand question is how many people need a house. The supply question is how many houses are there. He treats the housing stock as if it was fixed and the immigration as if it was variable, when both, of course, are variable. He's already talked earlier in the show about how we've only got 26 million people and we're in a massive continent and there's heaps and heaps of land. There could be a lot more accommodations for people to live in. He's only talking now about immigration's impact on house prices. Now, again, there's a kernel of truth in his analysis of the way that conversations have gone wrong around all of this stuff, because it is taboo in Australia and many places to talk about immigration being a contributing factor to high property prices. When the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, the former opposition leader, tried to raise this at a speech last year, one of Australia's most prominent and respected journalists gave a speech and said that he was doing racist dog whistles. I mean, he was trying to make the point that if you import 500,000 new people into the country every year, you can't expect it not to have an impact on house prices. They have to live somewhere, and we're not building at the pace that we need to be building to accommodate all those new people. That also puts pressures on hospitals. It puts pressure on schools. It puts pressure on roads. It puts pressure on public infrastructure, on public transport. All of those things are true, and it has become too taboo to talk about them. And one of the reasons why I've kept banging on and become such an annoying anti-woke lefty in recent years, and have copped so much criticism from people on the left for being, some kind of right-winger in sheep's clothing, or like the radical centrist, always being trying to be contrarian and heterodox about everything, is because I can see that if we make these issues taboo to talk about in a reasonable way, then unreasonable people like Tucker Carlson will be able to manipulate them. He is right that we should be able to talk about the impact of immigration on property prices. He is wrong that the only reason why property prices are high is because of immigration. There is also zoning rules. There's how high can you build. There's tax inducements. There's negative gearing. There's whether or not you can subdivide a property to create multiple properties on it. There's whether or not old people should be able to live in $10 million properties even if they don't have a lot of income without paying any property tax on it. There's the way that we expand cities. There's the way that inner cities go up. There's 1,000,001 ways in which any economist of housing will be able to tell you we have backed ourselves into this corner where property prices keep having an upward pressure. And immigration is one little part of that. It is one tiny part of an overall mosaic. But the overall mosaic doesn't fit the narrative that Tucker Carlson is trying to build. So he focuses on one thing. He takes the grain of truth that house prices are too high, the second grain of truth that supply and demand is always the cause of any phenomenon in the economy, and a third grain of truth, which is that it has been too taboo to talk about immigration as being a component of this. And then he jumbles them all up and spits out, again, this alchemy, this kind of gold thread of now we have yet another reason, yet another pillar of the cathedral that he is building in order for us to understand that all of our woes are attributable to the things that he wants us to believe they're attributable to. Namely, us being told that we don't belong here, us being told that Western civilization has something to be guilty of, us being told that, we just have to sit down and shut up and that the elites know how to run everything. And this allows him to construct this worldview and to reinforce our sort of, I would say, petty concerns with a rousing, bolstering, populist energy as to, these things aren't complicated multifactorial problems that are difficult for economists and public policymakers to get their head around. They're all just part of this one big narrative, which is that we're being stabbed in the back by elites who don't care about us, and it's time to step up.
And so if I'm running a country, one of my top concerns is making sure that young people in their, say, late 20s, early 30s, can afford a house. Because my main goal is to create households and a new generation of Australians or Americans or Kiwis or whatever. And so if it becomes too difficult, too expensive for your children to buy a house in the country they were born in, you're erased. That's it. Your line ends. And that's what's happening. You see it in the birth rates. This is true in my country too. This is not lecturing of you. I'm watching this happen. And in Canada, it's completely out of control. So why is it happening? Immigration. There's only one reason. That's the reason.
There's only one reason. That's the reason why people can't afford houses, which means that they can't pass on a life to their children, which means that they are being erased for one reason: immigration.
And nobody wants to say that because it sounds like an attack on immigrants, which, and by the way, that's how they get you to shut up. Shut up, racist. Okay, got it. But I'll just speak as honestly as I possibly can. The last group I hate are immigrants. I actually really like immigrants to my country. I'll just say my country. And we've let in 30 million illegally in the last 4 years. That's more than your entire population. So that's a crime. That's the greatest crime in American history. It totally destroyed my country. But I'm still not mad at the people who came because I would too. That's how I feel about immigration. You're coming to my country because you think it's the greatest in the world? Well, we're in agreement on that. I'm flattered by immigration, by the desire of people from around the world to come to my country. I would want to go there also. It's like people saying your wife is hot. Yeah, I think so. Thank you. You can't have her, but I'm glad that you noticed. So there's not an attack on immigrants. They always try to make it about immigrants. Oh, you're attacking immigrants. No, I'm attacking you, actually. I like the immigrants. I don't like you. And the reason I don't like you, leader of my country, is because this policy is making it impossible for our children to live here and to have the lives that we provided for them. Not, crazy fancy lives, but like a middle-class house with 3 bedrooms on a quarter acre. Is that too much to ask? It shouldn't be. Especially in a country the size of a continent where nobody lives in the middle of it. It's like a donut. It's bizarre. I flew over it. There's nobody here.
This is funny. He's saying that there's nobody here in Australia. So, why should house prices be so high when there's so much land? Yes, exactly, dum-dum. That means that it's not only a problem of demand. It's not only a problem of immigration. It's not a problem of Australia being overcrowded and having too many people. It's a policy failure across a whole bunch of different metrics. So I completely agree. Yes, we've been betrayed by successive leaders who have not done enough to address the need of Australians to have affordable housing for their children. But to blame it, to say that there is one cause, immigration, and then in the next breath to say that Australia is empty, those two things are contradictory. If Australia is empty, we should be able to bring in another 100 million people and wouldn't have any impact on house prices if we were building enough houses on the supply side, which he doesn't talk about.
So all of a sudden, if your children can't afford a house here, then you have one person to blame, and that's the people who run your government. And by the way, nobody does, because you're not allowed to. And by the way, in Great Britain, for example, Canada, for example, your closest cousins, your parent and first cousin, people go to jail for noticing. You literally go to jail. You don't like what the government's doing to you? Shut up, racist, and you go to jail. They send people to jail. UK, they send people to jail every day. And not for standing in, Hyde Park and screaming, but for writing it on Facebook. So imagine a government that totally destroys the country, which is criminal behavior, and then criminalizes complaining about it. That's not a legitimate government, that's a tyranny. That's a tyranny.
So here again is how the left has kind of tied itself up in knots and left itself enormously vulnerable to populists the like of Tucker Carlson. This censoriousness, this kind of attack on free speech, this hysteria about anyone who's expressing a controversial or uncomfortable opinion on social media or elsewhere is coming back to bite us in the ass. What he's talking about is a real problem. The fact that in the United Kingdom, I mean, I was on a panel show here in Australia, Q&A last year with the e-safety commissioner, who is she's not there in the post anymore, but she was the person who was essentially looking out for digital safety and online safety. And a lot of what that had to do with was cracking down not just on bullying, but also on hate speech and incitements to violence. And on this television program, I got into an argument with her about whether or not it was an incitement to violence for people like Douglas Murray and Elon Musk during the riots in the UK in the last summer, not this past one, but summer of last year, to say that civil war is inevitable, for example, and that if the government doesn't do something about immigration and doesn't do something about better integrating migrant communities, then the UK is going to suffer enormous civil strife. Now, it may be tactless to say such a thing. It may be impolitic to say such a thing. It may even be inflammatory to say such a thing. But the claim that it is specific incitement to violence which should be taken down from social media and potentially prosecuted, which these kinds of remarks are in the UK. Canada I'm less familiar with, don't know what they're doing over there. But, Graham Linehan was arrested at the airport arriving from the United States into the UK for transphobic tweets because he's unusually obsessed with this particular issue, and he believes that, biological sex is basic and that anyone who claims to be a sex other than the one that they were assigned at birth is, illegitimate and should not be given the courtesy of treating them as if their gender is different from their biological sex. Whatever. It's a big world. We live in a big democracy where, we're smart people. We should be capacious enough in our conversations to be able to tolerate people we disagree with and to shoot down their ideas by attacking those ideas, not by arresting those people. We've left ourselves enormously vulnerable to people like Tucker Carlson because we've lost the ability to have reasoned debates with one another where we go after each other on the content of what we're talking about rather than waving placards and trying to hound people and trying to get their publishers to disown them and trying to get them to read out pro forma apologies for ways in which they've been racist or sexist or tin-eared or the way that they didn't understand what marginalized communities they were offending in their work, and they're going to try to do better and all this sort of stuff. And now that we're at a point at which things are so white hot in some places like the UK on issues like this, that even to talk about the question of, look at the conversation around grooming gangs in the UK, for example, where there were literal criminal networks of South Asian, I believe they were cab drivers, who were trading teenage girls and getting them addicted to drugs and pimping them out and so on. And there was a sense that this was somewhat overlooked by the police in the UK because it was like, well, this is just one of those communities. These are sort of dodgy, poor girls from broken homes in the first place. So they're probably kind of asking for it. And we don't want to go stomping in and kicking heads in this migrant community because we have to be tactful towards the different ways of doing things and, don't ask too many questions and just trust the community leaders when they say that they've got a hold of it and they're onto it and everything. It was absolutely shameful, and there was way too much emphasis on multicultural sensitivity and not feeling like you're the white colonial imperial savior trying to crack down on these, unduly indecent hordes who are living in your midst. Instead of a hard-nosed attempt to follow the letter of English law and uncover any instances in which it was being broken. All of this whole kind of, progressive identity politics reckoning that has happened on the left has left us with our pants down when someone like Tucker Carlson comes along and says, I should be able to talk about this stuff. You do have a right to decide who comes into this country. You do have a right to be proud of who you are. And you certainly have a right not to be arrested for making the case, even if it's an erroneous one, that property prices are high because there are too many Chinese people coming into Australia. Like that should be a claim that can be assessed in public discourse without being booted out. And this is the sort of underlying, sort of conundrum that I'm trying to wrestle with here. And I don't have an easy answer to it because I don't think that Nick Fuentes' claim that organized Jewry is behind most of the world's problems is a problem that ought to be aired and wrestled with, because it's not a very clever idea and it's pretty easy to see that there's no way to falsify it. Like, it's not a claim that you can really engage with because it's essentially just a conspiracy theory. On the other hand, we do need to open the envelope up so that people like Tucker Carlson don't just, the conversational envelope, that is, the kinds of things that we can talk about in polite society without getting hounded out of our jobs by, angry mobs on Instagram or something. Or as one colleague of mine recently did, having a non-profit reject his 5-figure donation to them because they didn't think that he was the correct kind of person for them to be associated with. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. We need to be able to expand the nature of the conversation that we're having so that it doesn't feel so tight and so constraining and so constipated that people like Tucker Carlson can weave their web of alchemy and just punch through the whole thing and say, look, why can't we just ask questions? Who are you to say that I don't have the right to talk about the way that organized cabals of Jews might be ruining everything? I think it would be easier to delineate how silly that conversation is if we had been less hysterical about claiming that a whole bunch of other, much more reasonable conversations were out of bounds.
And if that were happening in some widely recognized tyrannical country, East Germany, 1975, where everyone's under surveillance. By the way, I don't think East Germany, 1975, which was famously the most surveilled nation in the history of the world, I don't think they had seatbelt cameras. I don't. No, they didn't. That was too far even for Eric Honecker. He's like, that's old fascist for me. I can't do it. So these countries have become, including my own, have become surveillance states. And the point of that surveillance is not to keep you safe. It's to punish you for noticing what they're doing to your country, actually. That's not the behavior of a legitimate government. And if you think that's like a right-wing point, you've bought the lies. That's not a right-wing point. That's a simple observation about human rights. No privacy, no freedom. Not to mention the endless hectoring. No, it's not your country. I went to buy a pack of cigarettes today. I quit smoking 10 years ago, but I thought, you can kind of judge a country by its cigarettes. Couldn't find them. I went to this tobacco store. I said, this is a tobacco store. You don't have any cigarettes? Oh, there's a really nice Pakistani guy. He's like kind of shaking his head like, I know it's crazy. Opens up this cabinet, and I said, what? That's like, what the hell is on your cigarettes? Like, I don't even want to smoke them looking at that.
For non-Australians, what Tucker Carlson is talking about here is that for years, Australia has had a law where cigarettes can't be displayed in public. So if you walk into a tobacconist, they have to be behind a white counter with a shelf where there's no signaling. And on the cigarette pack itself, all cigarette packs look the same. There is no longer any marketing. Cigarette companies aren't allowed to have brands. They're not allowed to write their name in a font that they want. They're not allowed to put an insignia on the pack. The pack is all standardized government issued. I mean, not government issued, but government mandated packaging. So the packs all look the same, and they're covered in grotesque images of people dying of cancer with an enormous label of how it's going to kill you on it. And the only way you can tell one from the other is the fact that one says Marlboro and the other one says Benson and Hedges or whatever it might be. And they're kept away so you can't see them.
I was like, you're making me not want to smoke, Mr. Tobacco Store guy. And he goes, I know. And every pack had like a rotted tongue on it or something. And again, I don't smoke cigarettes anymore. But I'm an adult man who pays his taxes. If I wanted to, I should be allowed to, right? You can do fentanyl here with the government's help. But you can't smoke a Marlboro without being lectured? Ugh. I did ask how much they cost. It was $60 for a deck of 20. And I said to the guy, I don't want to smoke. And I've never said that in my life. And I know everyone's like, well, smoking's bad. Yeah, of course smoking's bad. Lots of things are bad. But it's not really anyone's business, is it? I guess wearing a seatbelt's a good idea. I mean, I don't, but my kids say it's a good idea. But when they're forcing you to do things for your own good, over time you question, like, is this really for my own good, or are they just softening me up to obey? So when it really comes down to it, when they want to inject me with some creepy compound that hasn't been tested, that they'll be able to shoot me with a rubber bullet if I decline. And I'll be so trained to be obedient that I'll kind of put up with it. And I won't do what I should do, which is stage, I don't want to say I don't get arrested. I shouldn't put up with that. Because that is not a free country, that's a tyranny. And you have absolutely no obligation under the most basic precepts of human rights and natural law to put up with that for 1 second, period.
He said something interesting there. He caught himself and didn't say what he was going to say. He said if, they are trying to essentially groom you into being obedient and get you acclimatized to obeying everything that they want you to do, then it's sort of your obligation to stand up and not put up with it. He said, I would stage and then he caught himself and said, I don't want to get arrested. Stage a revolution? I don't know. I mean, obviously he was worried about the accusation that he was fomenting violence or something by saying that you should disobey such laws. He's putting his finger here yet again on something that's a really interesting true fact about a place like Australia, which, as I've mentioned in the past, has a strange relationship to authority. Australians love a rule. Australians are quite obedient. Australians love to think of ourselves as being devil-may-care people who just shun all rules and reject authority. In actual fact, we don't like other people telling us what to do. So we don't like being instructed or bossed around. We still have that kind of, I suppose, convict sensibility of wanting to be able to get away with things. But on the other hand, the moment you put that rule on a sign or in a law book, we are extremely obedient people. We love lining up in lines. We love following rules. We love obeying speed limits. We love lining up to get our vaccines when the government tells us to. And this is a curious fact. I mean, of all of the Western democracies, certainly in the Anglosphere, Australia and New Zealand were by far the most obedient during COVID. And I don't know whether this is sort of part of the fact that we're located in East Asia and have high East Asian populations. And by the way, there's a sociological phenomenon that's worth being aware of here, which is the difference between horizontal trust and vertical trust in a society. Sociologists talk about how there are some societies that have high horizontal trust, which means trust in your fellow man. And there are some that have high vertical trust, which means trust in authority figures and institutions and governments and so on. So you can think of countries that might have very low vertical trust, low trust in governments, but high horizontal trust. Maybe a place like Greece would be somewhere like this, where you can leave your door unlocked, but you would never trust the government and you'd try not to pay taxes. And there are other places where you wouldn't trust your fellow man and you would be very suspicious of strangers in the street, but you would trust authorities to be doing the right thing. And this is frequently characterized as an East Asian outlook. In Australia, we sort of have both, but we certainly have much more trust vertically than any other comparable country does. Now, the claim that Tucker, once again, is taking something that is true and he's putting his finger on it, and instead of just being curious about it and open-minded about it, despite all of his rhetoric about I'm just asking questions, I'm just curious, I'm just interested in things, he's not actually that curious because he doesn't really dig in and go, isn't it weird that there's this Western English-speaking democracy that has this characteristic of just generally being more obedient than the others, and I wonder why that is. Instead, he has the reason for it. And his reason for it always comes back to this narrative that he's trying to build. All credit to him. He's allowed to build whatever narratives he wants to. He obviously thinks that this is one that works. I don't know whether he believes it, but it's certainly one that works for him. It's functionally a useful narrative. It's compelling. It sounds persuasive to the people he wants to persuade. This narrative that everything is basically going to shit because there's a big cabal of elites who are betraying us and stabbing us in the back. And a lot of that has to do with them trying to replace us, trying to denigrate us, trying to make us feel guilty, trying to import too many people to essentially eradicate Western civilization, Christianity, and white people. And in this instance, he's doing that by taking this truth about Australian obedience, and instead of being genuinely curious about it and having uncomfortable conversations about why we might be more obedient than other societies, he's saying we're obedient because we've been trained to be obedient by cynical, sinister people who take us one step of the way and try to get us to obey them more and more and more in a plan to subjugate us eventually. And this is why COVID was such an instructive and useful anecdote for so many people on the libertarian right, especially in the United States, because they saw our reaction to COVID and they were like, well, obviously these people are just being buttered up for tyranny, because if they're willing to tolerate this, and Tucker talks about rubber bullets, he talks about it a lot in the rest of the this speech as well, which I didn't initially know what he was talking about, but he's obviously seen something on TikTok or Instagram Reels about some Australian being shot with rubber bullets, maybe for when they were being, I don't know, during COVID. I don't quite understand, but it was, having lived here during COVID, I can reassure Tucker and all the Americans, it was not a routine fact of life during COVID that we were all getting shot with rubber bullets in order for the police to be able to jab us in the arms. It's entirely possible that when people were trying to make a break for it out of some mandated quarantine in the height of the pandemic, that happened. But I don't know what he's referring to necessarily. But he is referring to a specific, interesting fact about the Australian population, which was that even at the end of COVID, the politicians who were the most aggressive about infringing people's rights during COVID were wildly popular. People loved the lockdowns. I mean, they loved the sense of certainty and security that level of vertical trust gave them in their community and in their overlords. That is a very different sensibility from the American kind of Western frontier model of sort of rugged libertarianism. I think it's simplistic for Tucker to blame it on elites who are trying to persuade us into being more obedient. It is an interesting thing that would be worth exploring, but to explore it honestly would be to undermine the narrative that he's trying to construct. So let's just go back to that.
They are the criminals. You are not the criminals. They don't care about your country, which belongs to you. So when they tell you it's not your country, that you're on someone else's land and you should feel bad about that, how is that a democracy? It's not a democracy. Because what's the basic idea of democracy? The citizens own the country. It's their country. It's not feudal land. They're not living here at the pleasure of the Lord. They can't just be shot with rubber bullets if they disagree with his decrees, because they own it. They're not renters, they're owners. That's the basic idea of democracy. However it's administered, whether it's a parliamentary system, whether it's direct democracy, as in Athens, whether it's a constitutional republic, representative democracy is the one that I live in, the idea never changes. The country belongs to its people, period. And if they're telling you at every landing of every commercial flight, in every government speech at the entrance to the Anglican church in downtown St. Paul's, that it's not your country, you cannot put up with that. Yeah, you cannot put up with that.
So now watch what a masterful speaker and debater and arguer Tucker Carlson is and how persuasive he can be. He's now bringing together a few different themes. I don't know if he plans this in the way that he thinks about the way the speech is going to unfold, or if he's just a natural talent and naturally gifted. But he's set up already being made to feel guilty on the basis of land acknowledgements and being told that the original custodians of the land still have a claim on it, therefore we are basically interlopers and settlers. Then he's moved on to COVID and coronavirus and our obedience and the vaccines and apparently all getting shot with rubber bullets by the police. Both of those two things are interesting, grains of truth. The Australian acceptance for authority, the Australian love of a rule, the Australian obedience during the pandemic, and also the extent to which Australia has bought into this virtue signalling conversation around how we have to constantly be paying lip service to Indigenous land tributes. And he's bringing them together and saying that the reason why you are vulnerable and ripe for the picking by authoritarians who were basically testing you during COVID to see whether or not you would cop being shot with rubber bullets is because you don't have a backbone, because you've bought this lie that this is not your country and this is not your land. Now, it's a persuasive kind of case. I don't know to what extent it's true. They strike me as two different phenomena. It's certainly clear to me that Australia's overreach during coronavirus was partly a consequence of happenstance and accident because of how successfully Australia was able to lock out the virus by closing its borders early on, which meant that when the virus did come here in a more revised form, in other words, Omicron and, Delta and then Omicron, those waves, especially the Delta wave, which was just as everybody was getting vaccinated, could have been a lot worse than it was had it swept through the country when we were unvaccinated versus vaccinated. So it's just a weird sort of technocratic thing and a government failure for not having procured vaccines earlier. So it's both that, and also bear in mind that when Australia was going through the pandemic, we were not led by a lefty sort of authoritarian, like pro-Indigenous land acknowledgement party. I mean, the government at the time was a conservative and socially conservative party. The Prime Minister was one of the most overtly devout Christians we've had in the office. He's a member of Hillsong Church. He's a Pentecostal, an evangelical Christian. And he would have had no truck with land acknowledgements or with this kind of black armband view of history, trying to make white Australians feel guilty for their past. That wasn't his bag at all. And yet he was still responsible for presiding over one of the most authoritarian responses to COVID in the rich democratic world. And that was wildly popular for a whole bunch of interesting cultural reasons. But instead of being curious about such reasons, it suits Tucker Carlson's worldview and the narrative that he's trying to expound to say that is being done by the same elites. It's all this shadowy kind of elites, right? They're all in it together. Yes, the Prime Minister might have been a social conservative, and he might have had nothing in common ostensibly on the surface with the kinds of people who are deciding that when Qantas lands a plane, it's going to tell you that the Indigenous name of the people whose land you're landing on. Maybe they superficially have nothing in common, but what they have in common is that they're not you, they're not the little guy, they're not the real people, they're not the citizens. Which brings him to this latest point that he's just making here, which is about how the owners of a country are its citizens. And this is a powerful and profound and true point. The citizens own a country in the democracy. He's absolutely right. And there is too often from governments on both sides of the aisle in all Western countries a disregard flagrantly for the fact that it is the citizens, it is we the people who decide what happens in this country and who own the fate of this country. Now, the latest and most egregious example of that sort of disregard comes from Tucker Carlson's mate, Donald Trump, who, as president, is trying to dramatically expand denaturalization. Now, unbelievably, I didn't even know that this was legal because I had so drunk my own Kool-Aid on thinking that citizenship made you an owner of the country that I didn't think it was possible for the government to strip you of your citizenship. They might be able to lock you in a cage for the rest of your life. They might be able to kill you in the electric chair, but they can't not make you a member of the country that you are a member of. Nonetheless, Trump's top aide, Stephen Miller, on immigration, is the brains behind his immigration policy, declared last year, America is for Americans and Americans only. Sort of tautological, kind of makes sense. But it's interesting what he means by Americans, because he doesn't exactly mean what Tucker Carlson claims to mean when Tucker's talking about citizenship. He seems to mean more what Tucker was alluding to earlier in the speech when Tucker talked about native-born Americans. The Trump administration, I'm getting this from the Brennan Center, which is one of the leading legal think tanks in the United States. The Trump administration Justice Department has been instructed to, quote, maximally pursue denaturalization proceedings with broad flexibility on who to target. Now, stripping a U.S. citizen of their citizenship has traditionally happened, after I did some reading, at a pace of about 11 people per year. And it's usually people who have just become citizens and they lied and it turned out that they were actually a Nazi, in the past, or they were a member of a terrorist group and they got their passport accidentally by lying on the form. They get denaturalized, stripped of their citizenship. It only happens less than a dozen people a year in a country of 340 million people. But Trump and Stephen Miller are trying to aggressively ramp that up so that U.S. citizens, natural-born U.S. citizens, if they're the kinds of people who the Trump administration does not deem worthy of being citizens, and at the moment they're talking in terms of people, for example, whose parents are undocumented immigrants, are illegal immigrants, or whose parents are, they're migrants whose paperwork isn't in order, and they're not citizens themselves, but they have a child in the United States, that child gets citizenship. They're looking at aggressively ramping up denaturalization. But does anyone how much faith do you have that the denaturalization move that's orchestrated by the likes of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump is going to limit itself judiciously only to people who were born of illegal immigrants and accidentally got their citizenship that way, and that it won't also try to incorporate people who might be representatives of the far-left Antifa, Hamas cabal that the administration seems to fear is going to take over America if it doesn't put tanks in the streets. This is worrying. I completely agree with Tucker Carlson. The citizens own the country. Once you're a citizen, you're a citizen. It's your country. That is who you own it, essentially. You should not be able to be stripped of it for almost any reason. So the cynicism with which Tucker Carlson can get on his soapbox and talk about how powerful elites are trying to get us all to comply with their overbearing COVID restrictions by telling us that this is not our country and betraying the fact that we, the citizens, own the country, is this strange but sophisticated and sort of awe-inspiring melange of disparate points that he is weaving together like a master conductor to build this narrative. I'm frankly gobsmacked at how good he is at doing this, which is why I find him so terrifying as a potential presidential candidate, not to mention just to a lesser degree right now as a force in popular culture. Again, each of these things are true. Citizens do own the country. Governments do ride roughshod over citizens' rights, especially when they try to strip citizens of their citizenship, as Donald Trump, who's on Tucker Carlson's side of the political aisle, is currently doing. It is also true that there's been an overreach on the sort of sense that Western civilization is essentially corrupt and we're the bad guys and colonialism was terrible and the genocide of indigenous people was terrible. Therefore, that overemphasis on the bad aspects of Western history has occluded some people's measured, judicious judgment about the sort of net positive effects of Western civilization, and also just pissed off a whole bunch of people who don't want to be told that they are, enjoying the fruits of a rotten tree. And it's also true that this country that Tucker Carlson finds himself in is weirdly obedient and probably went a bit too far during COVID, although it's also worth noting something that he doesn't, which is that the vaccines were safe. Yes, there were obviously side effects and some people got hurt, and that's terrible, and those were known about, and that was all part of the risk profile of saving the largest number of lives. Not, as has been said, if the cure for COVID was peanut butter and you gave everyone peanut butter, then a certain number of people would die from eating peanut butter because peanut butter kills some people, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a good thing to do. And Australia had 90% fewer COVID deaths per capita than the United States did. So there was a payoff. This is not to say there wasn't overreach, but to say that the overreach was part of an orchestrated campaign by the kinds of people who want to make you feel guilty about your colonial past in order to get you used to their tyranny so that they can strip away your citizenship is a mind-boggling juggling act that when you hear it the first time, you don't notice how impressive it is, albeit, I would say, somewhat illogical.
Because what's going to happen is what's happening now, which is they will completely change your country, make your life much worse, make it absolutely impossible for your children to have the lives that you gave them. In other words, for your civilization to continue, because that's what that is. They will eliminate all of that, and you won't be able to say a word because why are you complaining? It's not your country. And I can promise you that in 50 years, what you have will not exist. It will not exist. I'm sorry to say that out loud. The only reason I'm saying that, it's such a heavy thing to say, and it makes me, I feel a little rude saying it. But I just liked what I've seen so much. I've been so impressed by this country that I think to myself, really, the only way you could wreck a place like this is on purpose. Really, is on purpose. You don't need anything here.
Well, Tucker, if the only way to ruin a place like this is on purpose, I can think of a way to do it on purpose, which would be to, in one's quest for power, fame, and money, to pick at people's sense of vulnerability and sense of uncertainty and to try to convince them that the reasons for the world being complicated and leaving them behind is that there is a clan of individuals, of elites, who are conspiring to screw them, stab them in the back, and that the main mechanism that those elites are using to do so is migrants, flooding them with migrants, making their houses unaffordable, stripping away their dreams. Because that is sure to foment a level of, I would say, irrational unrest and civil disobedience. And also, not that there's anything wrong prima facie with civil disobedience, but when it's directed at amorphous blobs that are not the real culprit, it's not very constructive. And also, a breakdown in community relations. I mean, what could be more corrosive to a successful multicultural society than for what Tucker Carlson calls the native-born population to believe that the reason why there are problems in a very problem-filled world, especially one where the problems are constantly shoved in your face thanks to social media algorithms, that the cause of those problems is migrants, is the non-native-born population. So, yeah, I mean, it's possible that it's true that the only way to ruin a society like this is on purpose. And if I had to think about the people who, it strikes me, are, if not trying to undermine these societies on purpose, are at least behaving in ways that show a reckless disregard for those societies' well-being, for the cohesion of their cultures, and for the sane and constructive conversation-making of their people, Tucker Carlson would be one.
Hearing about your energy costs almost drove me, I almost put my fist through the wall. Someone was saying, well, I can't do that. I was asking dumb questions, you have, the world's largest deposits of iron ore from which steel is made. I said, well, how many steel mills? Well, none. Why? Because energy's too expensive. I said, well, too bad you don't have any thermal coal here. Oh, wait, you have the world's largest deposits of thermal coal in the world? So why do you have such high energy costs? Well, because we sell our coal to China, which uses it to make renewables, which we then buy back. Okay. Whoever thought of that hates you. I'm just being honest. That's not an accounting error. That was not a mistake made in good faith. It's not like the accountants over at Parliament House or whatever they call it. They're look at the books one day and be like, all those estimates we had about wind farms, it actually doesn't add up. That we sell our country's resources to a faraway country to make something that doesn't work and then pay extra for it. They knew that wasn't going to work when they did it, obviously, because that's insane. It's prima facie insane. The fact that you have high energy costs is reason enough to get rid of the people who are running your country. Because guess what? Everybody else knows, except the English-speaking countries, including mine, which are on one level the most impressive countries that have ever existed in human history, clearly. Certainly the kindest and most decent. Well, they gave us science, okay? They invented the airplane. They're the most impressive societies ever created, but they're also on some level the most naive or the dumbest. What everybody understands around the world is that there's a direct line between cheap energy and civilization. The cheaper energy you have, the fewer babies who die when they're born, period. The cheaper energy you have, the fewer women get worn out by life in their mid-30s. I mean, go to countries with expensive energy in the developing world, and you will see the physical toll on people from having to live in a society where they can't afford energy.
Tucky boy, may I? A point of order, just a quick question. Josh Seps, Uncomfortable Conversations. Do you think there might be any other reasons why people in poor countries where energy is very expensive might not be rich? Do you think maybe the reason why they're not rich there is because they're not rich? That could also have something to do with why they don't lead rich lives. I'm spitballing. I'm just wondering. I'm just trying to cast a wide net here. Obviously, I think it should be pretty clear that the high cost of energy is a bad thing, and we should want cheap energy. We should also want to make sure that we have energy that is not very cheap right now, but has massive negative externalities that we're going to have to pay for and be deranged by later on, which is why coal is a little bit tricky, because very cheap now, but living through the second half of the 21st century with massive migrant refugee flows disrupting liberal democracies because the monsoons have been disrupted, or because there are constant droughts and we're getting constantly battered by harsher and more frequent storms and bushfires, and we're having to invest enormous amounts of time and energy and just money into relocating Miami or figuring out how to do hydroponics because old farmland isn't fruitful anymore. Like, all of that has to be just factored into the question of how expensive a particular energy source is. Again, Tucker Carlson here is doing what Tucker Carlson does best, which is taking a small true thing and then giving it a mono cause instead of treating the world as the complicated place that it actually is. So absolutely true that Australian energy prices are way too high. It is inexcusable in a country that has as many energy resources as we do that has been so badly mismanaged. One major reason, not the only one, because I'm not Tucker Carlson, but one major reason why energy is expensive in Australia is because the energy sector has never had any predictability about how Australia is going to respond to carbon emissions. And that is because of Tucker Carlson's side of politics mostly, and his mates. The Labor government over 10 years ago tried to bring in a carbon tax. They tried to bring in a mining resources super profits tax to keep some of the money from our mining back here in Australia, the way that the Norwegians do, have a kind of a futures fund to keep some of the revenue. Big business and lobbyists shot that down. The government lost an election. The Conservatives came in. They scrapped the carbon tax idea. And ever since, I mean, this is not the only reason, again, but ever since it is implausible for Conservatives who are coal boosters like Tucker Carlson to say to the energy sector, to big electricity companies who are considering whether or not to invest absolute bucket loads of money into new energy supply and into where their resources are going to go in terms of the energy mix, to simply tell them, don't worry about the whole carbon thing. There's no price on carbon, and we're not entering a carbon emissions trading scheme, because of course the executives of big energy companies, they don't necessarily mind if you start taxing carbon or trading carbon, but they can see the way the winds are going, and they just don't believe that coal is going to be financially viable. They don't believe that people are going to allow their governments to make coal financially viable indefinitely if it's going to take them 20 years to get a new coal-fired power plant up to profitability, and the life of that power plant might be 40 or 50 years. So, one reason why we've screwed the pooch so much on this is because Tucker Carlson's side of politics has been such coal boosters that they haven't been willing to sit down and just talk to the industry and go, okay, this is how it's going to go. Coal's going to be phased out in this very predictable way, and it's going to be replaced by this, this, and this. Maybe nuclear is part of the mix, whatever. But to simply say that we're getting railroaded by people who are trying to make our energy costs more expensive because I suppose the implication is they want us to be like poor people in those snotty, sooty developing countries where, women die in childbirth or whatever. There are a lot of reasons why poor women die in childbirth. It's because they're poor. It's not just because energy costs are high. B, you have to factor in all of the externalities of any particular energy source. C, the reason why we have high energy costs is partly because governments have not been able to reckon with the reality that the industry knows they need to reckon with of how we're going to deal with climate chaos and with the energy mix that climate chaos demands. So again, taking true things, high cost of energy, the fact that cheap energy is good, the fact that governments have bungled this, and making them yet another pillar of this basic overarching narrative about how the real cause of the problem is that we are being willfully and willingly misled and betrayed by our overlords.
There's people out. It wrecks their lives. We're happy because we have cheap energy in a lot of ways. And so if they're intentionally making it more expensive, just like if they're making it impossible for your kids to buy houses, or if they're shooting you with rubber bullets, at some point you have to connect the dots and say, these people aren't just neglecting me, they hate me. There's no other explanation for that. By the way, if this were happening in a family, so the model for all human organizations is the family, which is the building block of any civilization. Mom, dad, kids. I know they're trying to scramble that a little bit. Future generations will look back on this and be like, that was the craziest thing that ever happened. That ever happened. I have an idea. Why don't you castrate your children? Yeah. By the way, I thought the government, when I was a kid, I know I'm digressing, but there's just so much. This country is so close to the country I live in, it's like really weird. It's like running into a relative you didn't know you had. You're like, wow, we look alike. How strange. Except you use the word wanka, and I don't know what that means. But in every other way, it's my new favorite word, by the way. I'm putting it in my suitcase for the trip home tomorrow. I'm going to unveil it at dinner parties. And I'm never going to ask anybody what it means, because I know it's something bad. But if I know, then I won't be able to say it with a straight face. But I'm going to drop that, no exaggeration, the second I get home at dinner. Be like, you're all wankas. I learned that from my Australian friends. Excuse me. Anyway, but the building block of any civilization is, of course, the family, the nuclear family. Husband, wife, children. Because that mirrors the natural order, the biological order, from which everything is derived. Now, Christians believe that's because God set it up that way. But also, scientists believe that because it's true, and there's no debating that it's true, okay? And so it would stand to reason that the deepest desire of the human heart, of course, is to reproduce. That's the whole point, right? That is the story of evolutionary biology, is to reproduce, to pass on your genes. And you get to a certain age, and you've done that, and so the most pressing agenda on your list is to have grandchildren before you die. And so if they're telling you, no, what you really want, no, you got that wrong. In fact, 1 million years of human civilization has got it totally wrong. We just figured it out about 18 months ago. What you really want is to castrate your children, and then you'll have no hope of passing on your genes, and then you'll be happy. By the way, they don't buy this in real countries like China. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah, all right. It's like green energy. You think the Chinese believe in green energy? Right. They're buying your coal because they don't. Not for 1 second. They're like, oh, the White Swan wind farms, let's make some more. This is why everyone hates the Chinese. I do not hate the Chinese. They're doing what they think is in their best interest. I mean, I don't want to live in China, okay, at all. I detest the fact it's an atheist society. There's a lot about China I don't like. I hate the way they treat animals. But I hate that, actually. But one thing I admire about China is they act in China's interest. I'm sorry, I can't complain about that. That's what countries are supposed to do. I wish we had leaders like that. In my country, you spend all this time hating on China. It's like, let's take out the kind of murdering people for their organs part, or the eating dogs, which are deeply offensive to me. But let's keep the part where the government acts in the interest of the nation, which is the only legitimate use of a government's power. Like, I admire that. So if they can sell you wind turbines or solar panels because you're dumb enough to send them your coal to do it, kind of in the W column for China, no?
Just in case it isn't incredibly obvious, the amount of energy that it takes to build a wind turbine or a solar panel is nowhere near as much as the amount of energy that they put out over the course of their lives. So this framing that he has where Australia sends coal to China and China sends solar panel and China uses the coal to build solar panels which it sends back to us sort of implies that we could have just kept the coal in the first place and generated as much energy as the solar panel is going to end up putting out. That's nonsense. It's a tiny, 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 tiny amount of coal that needs to go into producing a solar panel that will then produce clean energy for a very, very long time. So, you can argue with solar, you can quibble with wind, you could say nuclear should be part of the mix, but it's not a Ponzi scheme the way that he's trying to frame it. I will not comment on his comments about transgender people or, gay family life or whatever, mothers and fathers and castrating children and all that. I think that's just obviously sort of red bait that I think if he does become a phenomenal political force, he's probably going to have to soften down a little bit of that. I mean, once again, the question of whether or not children should be fast-tracked into gender reassignment surgery, or what the trans lobby wants us to call gender affirmation surgery, because it merely affirms the gender that the child was on the inside, even though they were assigned a different biological sex at birth. The idea that kids should be fast-tracked into that, and that any psychiatrist who asks questions of a 15-year-old autistic girl about whether or not she is experiencing any kind of other symptoms of depression or anxiety, or whether or not there is any peer contagion effect, that a psychiatrist who asks those questions is guilty of conversion therapy and can be reprimanded, which is the case in a lot of jurisdictions. Or the idea that biological males can declare that they are females and then make up quotas on, female boards and so on, or enter women's prisons. The idea that there should be no tolerance of a wider view of adolescent sexuality and confusion than simply the idea that the claims of children should be taken at face value instead of with a grain of salt. All of this overreach, all of this sort of moral panic, I suppose, has contributed, again, to a climate in which people like Tucker Carlson can make hay out of this stuff. I hope that in a couple of years' time, when he runs for president, which I think is somewhat inevitable. In fact, Tucker has mentioned that Lachlan Murdoch asked him to run against Trump after Lachlan fired him. So, you can watch that space. These issues, these hot culture war issues, would be so deprived of their currency and would land so much flatter than they do had it not been for the overreach of the left. But it's just interesting to see the way that Tucker is currently manipulating them.
What is that? It's yours and mine. I mean, my country does exactly the same thing. So you're not going to get me to rant about China. I want to learn from China. Maybe you guys can get your domestic manufacturing back and go sell windmills to somebody else who's dumb enough to buy them. You should do that. I've heard Belgium is looking to expand its green energy profile. And by the way, you could do that because you don't need anything. If there's one sincere criticism of Australians I would level after 2.5 weeks here, way too happy. It's such a happy country that people don't pause, A, to consider how bad it could be. They don't. And B, they don't really, with respect, in the US the same way, they don't really appreciate how great it is. They really don't. They don't. If you were designing a country, what would you want? Well, the first thing you would want is natural resources. Okay? That's the most important thing. The most important thing, and this may be news here in Melbourne, is not banking. It's not. Banking doesn't make an economy. Banking is, in some sense, possibly a necessary feature of advanced economies, but it's not integral to any economy. Loaning money and interest actually used to be considered disgusting. In fact, it was illegal. It still is illegal in some places. So the idea that we've made that the apogee of human achievement, lending money, no, it's not. No, making things is the point of life. Making things is the point of life. And in order to make things, you need resources. And you have more resources than you could ever use. For the next 1,000 years, you're totally set. You need nothing. You've got more than enough land. There's nobody here. There's nobody here. I've flown over beaches recently. I was like, what, was someone going to build a Club Med there or what? I just saw 30 miles of beautiful coastline. In my country, people would be murdered over the rights to that. Here, it's just oh yeah, we got a lot of that. No one lives here. You lead the world in resources, in gas, in bauxite, which is kind of important actually, in iron ore, in coal, in lead, in gold, you name it, copper, you've got it. The rest of the world, uranium. Oh my gosh, whoever said that, thank you. I totally forgot about uranium. Think of the deepest reserves in the world here. Did you say wanka? I don't think that's a natural resource, but maybe it is. I gotta look that up, actually. The point is, you don't need Great Britain. You don't need any other country. You could, honestly, kind of run the world. You've got no real poverty. No, there are poor people here, but you don't have dense concentrations of poverty that I've seen in 7 separate cities, and I look for it. You don't. You will, but you don't now. You've got a very well-educated and impressive and smart population. What don't you have? You don't need anybody around. You should be running the world. I personally would immediately buy a nuclear weapon just to make that point clear to the rest of the world. I'm not kidding. Probably not going to do that. You're not even allowed to have handguns. You're probably not buying nukes. But you should get both. Sorry, I know you hate that, but I feel that way. And once you realize that, then there is absolutely no reason to let your leaders destroy the place. You just need to say no. And the first thing you do, so how does that work exactly? I was getting so upset talking to this awesome Pakistani tobacco shop guy yesterday. The poor guy, you know? Anyway, it really bugged me. I had a long conversation with him about it that got so out of control that I can't repeat it here because we'll all be arrested. But he was on board. He's probably here tonight, by the way, if you're here. But how do you do that? How do you do that if you're an orderly, peaceful person, by the way? Because, you know, the problem with changing our society is it can move in super ugly directions super fast, and no decent person wants that. Now, the people running your country definitely want that. They're the ones who shot you with rubber bullets and set up concentration camps for you, in case you've forgotten. Wrecked the economy of Victoria and many other, right? I mean, the cost of that made you take the COVID shot and then ignored the injuries that it caused. Just totally ignored them. So they have no problem with force. But normal people have a lot of problem with force. I have a lot of problem with force. I'm a Christian. I mean, I'm a believer in a religion that rejects force, actually. Rejects hurting other people, that calls for you to pray for your enemies. It's a little weird that they hate Christians so much, don't you think, by the way? Parenthetically, it's a little strange. If I was running a country and I don't care what religion I was, I'd want to import a lot of Christians. Just because, by definition, like sincere Christians. Because literally their religion says you're not allowed to go hurt people. Instead, you have to kind of like work hard, stay married to the same person, take care of your children. I'm like, even if I thought the religion was absurd, even if it was not my religion at all, I'd be like, let's import a bunch of those. Because they're clearly the least threatening, the most productive citizens you could possibly have. In fact, this country was built originally by Christians. All those 5 countries were. That's why they're great countries. That's why they have human rights. Because respecting the rights of other people is a Christian precept. It doesn't exist in non-Christian countries. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Christians are unique in that they believe that each person was created by God, and therefore his rights, the right to say what you really think, the freedom of speech, the right to practice any religion you want, the right not to be a slave, those are endowed by God, not government.
I just cannot not jump in. There's a lot that could be said, but I won't go on forever here. He just said that respect for human rights only exists in Christian countries. No other countries that aren't Christian respect each other's rights. Obviously, factually untrue. Also, the extent to which we developed human rights law and an appreciation of a live and let live ethos, whilst informed by the preachings of Jesus, was, you know, can we give a little credit also to like the Enlightenment? And to, you know, secular philosophers, to the Scots. It wasn't all just Christians who were banging on about the Bible. I believe that the Christianity has done some, you know, it has been not quite so open-minded and tolerant as the secular Enlightenment rationalists all the time. So, slight quibble. It's just also worth noting that the way that he's talking here, although it lands in a fairly tin-eared way, I think, in the Australian context, because we're a very secular country, in the United States, you now have like 40% of the population who tell pollsters that they are basically Christian nationalists. They don't use those words, but when you ask them questions about the way that they want America to be, a much more theologically aggressive regime is something that they'd be comfortable with. So if Tucker does become a presidential candidate, you can imagine this is going to be something that he would lean into, which would be absolute catnip to the base of evangelicals who've had to find themselves holding their nose somewhat to vote for someone with as many personal peccadillos as Trump, but would now be able to throw their weight behind someone who speaks about Christian nationalism in this almost kind of messianic and deeply faith-based way.
Elbow didn't give you those. You were born with them. Yeah, no, I'm serious. So, like, why would they hate people like that? Those seem like, again, even if you don't agree with the religion, or any religion, wouldn't you want that? And of course, they're the ones they hate most. That tells you a lot about their agenda, I would say. And I think the thing that they hate most about Christians, leaving aside the spiritual explanations, which I personally think are real, but maybe you don't, but just as a political matter, what they don't like about Christians is Christians recognize that those rights are inherent They're bestowed by God, not people, and they can't be taken away. That's why Christians led the abolitionist movement. We don't have slavery because of Christians. And in non-Christian countries, there still is slavery. It's really simple. I'm sensing they don't teach this in Australian schools.
Yeah, they don't teach this in Australian schools because it's not true that the only reason why we don't have slavery is because of Christians. There was a long and complicated theological argument between Christians who were originally for slavery. A lot of Christians were defenders of slavery. Yes, there were people who were motivated by their Christianity who were in the abolitionism movement. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. There were a lot of strands of philosophical thought about the rights and wrongs of slavery at the time, and they didn't cleave innocently along any particular religious line. It's just factually untrue to say that the reason why there's no slavery is because of Christianity, and that in non-Christian places there's still slavery.
Right. Okay. The only reason we recognize that any of these human rights that we're supposedly defending are rights at all is because of Christianity. It's the only reason. That's the only reason. Who do you think defined those as human rights? Christians. Because they were Christians. So if you hate Christians, you're making me a little nervous. What exactly are we doing that's scaring you so much? Well, we're acknowledging a God above you. That's the real sin. Sorry, Jacinda Ardern. You're not God. You're just some silly lady with bad teeth. Like, stop.
Jacinda Ardern? It's Jacinda Ardern, dipshit.
No, I don't mean you harm, but I'm certainly not going to worship you. But they've set up this bizarre religion in your country. It's really noticeable. I'm sure you don't even notice it. It's like all these flags are flying all over the place. The transgender flag. I said to my driver yesterday, like, what is that? He's like, transgender. I can't even do his accent. I was like, who puts that up? The city? So that's your religion? Really? Yeah, it is. Well, you can't worship false religions. First of all, the state shouldn't be imposing a religion on you. That is a religion. Not so different from Rome. Worship our gods or we'll punish you. And the early Christians said, okay, I'll be punished then, because I'm not worshiping your gods. Happy to live next to you. I'm a tolerant person by my nature. Christians are tolerant by nature. They're not allowed to convert by force. They're not allowed to force you to believe anything, because God created you. We didn't. But the one thing I can't do, I'm not allowed to do, is worship false gods, including your transgender cult or whatever. You're transgender, you live next door? No problem. I mean, I worked in TV all my life. That's hardly the weirdest personal life I've ever seen, trust me. Totally happy to live next to people who are into freaky stuff. I don't want to hear about it, but I don't want to arrest them. But what I'm not going to do is worship them as gods, period, because I can't. So here's my quick advice to you, and I will stop, and we'll take your hostile questions maybe in a minute. But violence is never the answer, just isn't. It doesn't make things better. I've seen a lot of conflict in a lot of different countries. No one's really improved by it ever, and often usually things get much worse. The US had about the only violent revolution I've ever heard of that made things better. The only thing that works is telling the truth and bravery. And that actually does work. Total non-compliance. We used to call it, when I was a kid, in my country, we celebrated something called civil disobedience. And that was considered a virtue. Now it's considered a crime and they shoot you with rubber bullets. But back when I was a child, when the people who are now firing the guns with rubber bullets wanted to be in charge, they'd be like, no, that's the highest level of public service, is refusing to go along with unjust laws. And I still think that. I don't care whether they've changed their views. Doesn't bother me. My views will never change. You have absolutely no obligation to follow immoral laws. And you shouldn't. And so then the question is, well, why do people follow immoral laws? Like, after 30 years of telling you it's your body, your choice, one day you wake up and they're like, give me your arm, I'm going to inject you with something. Oh, I don't care for that. Shut up, or I'll send you to prison camp. So why do people go along with that? And the answer is, not because they want to, but because they don't, they're afraid. They don't want to be ostracized from the group. That's a huge one in Anglo countries. There's a huge premium in our culture, our common culture, in getting along with people, not being the one person being obstreperous or difficult. Like, pipe down. Just go along with it. Line up in an orderly way. That's a huge part of our culture. It's a great part of our culture, but that's the downside. And the other reason is that they fear being harmed. They don't want to be shot with a rubber bullet. They don't want to be arrested. They don't want to disrupt their lives. To which I would say, well, okay, but what's the alternative? And there's only one alternative, which is being destroyed and living like a slave. So the truth is, nothing changes until people are willing to face those consequences. That's just the truth. Like, what did you think this was? You really have to decide that you're not going to harm anybody, but that you are willing to be harmed. That's just the truth. You have to decide that. And if you don't decide that, I think it's very clear to me as a visitor where it's going because I've seen it. And you have to make that decision. I'm not going along with that. With respect. I'm not going to scream at anybody. I'm not going to be nasty to anybody. I'm definitely not going to hurt anybody. But there's literally nothing you can do to make me do that. And if I need to be punished, that's fine. I will be. Most people will not do that. Most people just, want to go to Bondi or whatever. They want to live their lives. I get it. I'm not attacking them. But it doesn't take everybody to change the society. If a small percentage of people firmly decide that they will not violate what is sacred to them, they will not worship false gods, they will not betray their own conscience and allow their families and their country to be destroyed. And under no circumstances will they participate in an immoral system. If a small group of people, 10% of your population does that, I don't know, Gandhi kicked the British out of India after 300 years. It wasn't that hard. Wearing a loincloth. That actually happened. And it's happened time and again. So my strong advice to you, and I'll stop with this, remember what the consequences are, what's at stake. It's totally real. It's not your imagination. It's not your if they're telling you it's not your country, they're going to take it away from you, period. 2, you can't let that happen because it's too nice, and there are future generations of Australians who have the right to live as you lived. And 3, you don't have to hurt anybody, and you shouldn't hurt anybody. Hurting other people is immoral. That's why your leaders are illegitimate, because they hurt people. And that's wrong. But you have to be willing to be hurt. That's just true. Thank you.
So there you have it. The Australian Freedom Conference keynote address by Tucker Carlson. He's a brilliant orator and a terrifying person to have dabbling in ideas that could take us into some very dark places. And I'm coming back to Nick Fuentes and Hitler-loving anti-Semitic racists here. But it's just worth also understanding that as well as being a brilliant orator and a masterful button pusher and a great rabble-rouser, he's also a total fucking hypocrite. Because the reasons why he says in that speech that he loves Australia are all reasons that are best facilitated by a radical centrist, pragmatic, sort of social democratic center-left vision. Not by wokeness, not by, craziness and culture war stuff, but certainly not by highly fiscally mean conservatism, and definitely not by his strand of populist Make America Great Again Trumpism. He's talking about how Australia is great because it doesn't have the poverty that the United States does. Australia is great because it doesn't have poverty because it has better welfare programs and higher minimum wages than the United States does. And who defends welfare programs and high minimum wages? The left. He says Australia is great because our forebears invested in public services and public infrastructure. They invested all of the wheat revenue that they grew in the 19th century into public works. Well, who opposes big spending on public works? Usually it's the right wing of politics. I mean, unless they're giving money to their mates for some, in order to boost some particular sector. But generally, public infrastructure investment, public investment in public goods is a hallmark of the left, not of the Tucker Carlsons of the world. He says that Australians are great because we're well educated and we have all of the human capital that we would need to stand on our own 2 feet. Well, why are we well educated? Because we've had centre-left governments that have invested in public education. We haven't been deranged by constant squabbling and arguments over charter schools, and we don't fund our public schools through local property taxes, which entrenches inequality by meaning that people who live in poor neighbourhoods go to poor, shitty schools, and people who live in rich neighbourhoods go to expensive ones. It's a needs-based education system where each state allocates education so that the system functions properly. He talks about the fact that the Australian middle class is fabulous. Well, yeah, that's because we don't tolerate the levels of inequality that people like him are willing to tolerate in the United States of America. We have higher taxes on the rich and we have better social programs for the poor. He extols the fact that Australians are really keen on wildlife and we're really nice towards our, native animals. Well, okay, but, we also run factory farms, and he eats meat and lives in a country that runs factory farms, and he's only using this as a pretext to then get on to a point that he's trying to make about how the Chinese eat dogs, ostensibly, supposedly. I'm not sure that dogs are big on the menus in China. I think he's thinking of Southeast Asia. But, it's always in service of this grander narrative that he is trying to articulate. And when he drops the breadcrumbs to build the pillars towards the big flourish at the end, where he can kind of tie it all together and say, you're being forced to follow immoral laws, you're being rendered obedient, you're being made to feel guilty through no fault of your own, and fundamentally you're being replaced by a secret, sinister cabal of elites who, if you follow the dots, are not just incompetent, are not just imperfect in the way that they're dealing with a very complicated world full of competing priorities, but are systematically and intentionally trying to undermine you and make sure that your children have to pay through the roof for energy, have to pay through the roof for housing, and are put out of their own countries by migrants, even stripped sometimes of their own citizenship. Unless you sort of interrogate every single one of the pillars as they're being constructed and go, oh, okay, well, he's making a good point about this, but he's only doing that in order to give him credibility on the next step of his journey, where he's taking the thing that is a real, true problem, giving it an explanation and a cause that's only a half-truth in order to reach a conclusion that is almost entirely bullshit, like migrants are the reason why property prices are expensive. By the time you get to the end, the whole kind of edifice has been built, and you're not able to sort of go back in and pick out the ways in which he was being disingenuous all along. So suffice it to say, Donald Trump is trying to strip American citizens of their citizenship if they didn't acquire it in a way that he approves of. The Supreme Court will be chiming in on that. That is not consistent with Tucker Carlson's appeals to the importance of the citizens, the citizenry, being the owners of the country, who have a duty to stand up against their tyrannical overlords. Donald Trump and the Republicans are the side of politics who tolerate public squalor and underinvestment in public goods at the same time as their ally and lapdog Tucker Carlson goes to Russia to be feted by Vladimir Putin in a softball interview where he posts dispatches from big public infrastructure projects in Moscow and St. Petersburg and talks about how glorious and glamorous the Moscow subway looks in comparison to America's crumbling infrastructure. Yeah, well, of course. You get to spend a lot of money on infrastructure when you're communists. Capitalists don't spend a lot of money on public infrastructure. So what are you exactly, Tucker? What exactly is Tucker Carlson arguing for? Except to come to a country like Australia, see the fruits of a centre-left demos in comparison to the United States, that is, with universal health care, very high government-mandated minimum wages, robust social safety nets, real investment in public education, and a general disdain, most importantly perhaps, for the kinds of culture wars that Tucker Carlson himself peddles, and then for him to come here, see this, and go, you guys have got it so great, I'm going to tell you what you should do. You should import more of the kind of feeling of aggrieved white nationalism, white Christian nationalism that I'm using to tear apart my home country. That's what you need more of here. It only takes 10% of a population to stand up against the tyrants who are trying to replace you with all the migrants. It's a really fucking insidious thing to do. It's a nasty, small, petty worldview. And the reason why it sort of frustrates me so much is because he's so good at touching on things that are true. It is true that we have mishandled the conversation around mass immigration in Australia and the UK and the US. It is true that in the US it has been too taboo to talk about the total crisis at the southern border and the fact that illegal immigration is not a good thing, that the country needs to get its hands around, and that we need some compromise on. And the fact that we've had to have like sanctuary cities, and we've had to in order to be a good person, you've had to treat immigration law enforcement as if it's evil and simply breaking apart families, instead of saying, well, okay, that's just the enforcement of the law, but let's still support legal immigration. Similarly, you can see this in a million places in a million different ways in these culture war issues. In Australia, it should have been easier to say, I understand that you think that doing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of a meeting is great. Personally, I'm more focused on practical ways that we can improve reconciliation and relations between our different communities and improve the lot of First Nations Australians. I think it's a bit tokenistic. I'm not going to do it. You haven't been able to do that without getting such a pile-on from the media, from HR departments, from universities. I mean, it is just inconceivable. It has been made so taboo. Even just on, the question of Tucker picking at the trans scab again, that culture war, that hoary old culture war cliche. Like, had there been more of a conversation about winning hearts and minds instead of more conversations shouting people down as TERFs, we wouldn't find ourselves in a situation in which we're all so volatile and so vulnerable to these kinds of ideas. So he's right that we have lost the capacity to have conversations in a reasonable and sane way. And what's scary is that there are enough people who are disoriented for completely unrelated reasons. Globalization, economic decline, the decline of manufacturing, the rise of artificial intelligence, addiction to social media, algorithms, algorithmic news, the decline of newspapers. All of these things are very disorienting. And they have largely nothing to do with the kind of culture war stuff that Tucker Carlson is peddling. But because we've left ourselves vulnerable on the progressive side of politics to accusations of being censorious scolds who have lost our capacity to feel real empathy and respect for people who are doing it hardest and to be real champions of economic justice, and we've instead gotten into this crouch of very school-marmish word policing and thought policing to try to test whether you're on the right side of things. It provides an opening the size of an aircraft hangar for people like Tucker Carlson to come in and spin a worldview that makes a lot of sense when you don't do what I've just done and spend over an hour picking it apart and analyzing it. And what worries me is people don't have this time to do this. This is my job. I have the luxury of trying to analyze exactly when a charlatan is trying to hoodwink me and trying to spot where the magician is misdirecting me. Most people don't, and that's not their fault. So when Tucker Carlson sits down with someone who really admires Hitler and talks about how organized Jews, organized Jewry, is the source of all our problems, I'm left speechless, really, about how we got here. And it's not because I think there's an easy answer about whether or not claims that Jews are in a giant cabal that's betraying everybody deserve to be aired. It's more just my heartfelt concern that something is fundamentally broken about the way that we're having conversations about the most important issues of the 21st century. And there's only so many smarmy little podcasters like myself who can take pot shots from the sidelines before we are inundated by a tsunami of confused and confusing and manipulative propagandists who are peddling ideas so old and so tired that they are quite literally the oldest cliches in human civilization. The Jews being the ones who are stabbing everyone in the back. They're the capitalists, but they're also the communists. They're kind of sniveling and Machiavellian, but they're also incompetent and stupid. They're lazy and no good, and, they're a drain on society, but they're also hyper-productive and kind of crafty, and they take jobs away from other people. Like, they are flip sides of the same coin and always have been. This is a deep meme in civilizational consciousness. It's a strange phenomenon, anti-Semitism. It erupts in weird ways, and at the moment, it has lately been erupting in ways that dare not speak their name. Either an undue focus for some reason on the plight of Palestinians versus other dispossessed people in ways that talk about Zionists as being bloodthirsty barbarians who love the taste of children's blood and sort of those kinds of tropes. Or on the right in forms of white nationalism, which don't quite come out and talk about the Jews directly, but obviously believe that an Aryan white ownership of Western countries is desirable. And we're bleeding away from those subtle forms of anti-Semitism and race hate into much more overt ones. And Tucker Carlson is now officially a facilitator of that. The last thing I'll say about this is that as I am recording, one of the most influential right-wing think tanks in America, the Heritage Foundation, is in turmoil after its leader, Kevin Roberts, defended Tucker Carlson for having a Holocaust denier and white nationalist on his show. I don't know whether the leader of the Heritage Foundation will be able to keep his job, but there is an enormous split brewing on the right in America after many Republicans distanced themselves from Tucker Carlson, notably, though, as yet, not the president nor the vice president, who, let's face it, seem to enjoy this kind of playing footsie with white nationalism and this, the way that the kind of grievances of the populist Christian nationalist right are exemplified in people like Tucker Carlson. And the Heritage Foundation is the organization that produced the now infamous Project 2025, which was a list of plans of how Donald Trump, should he win his second term, which of course he went on to do, would radically reshape American government, American bureaucracy, and American life. So if you ever thought Tucker Carlson was a sideshow, he ain't anymore. I hope it's useful to break down the way that he constructs his arguments, the way that he uses his good points to bolster his bad points, and to think carefully when you speak to other people who sound convincing and conspiratorial and commonsensical in ways that are just a little bit too tidy, a little bit too neat, a little bit too manipulative and pat. I'll see you for a regular episode next time.